Picture this. A man so feared that entire noble houses flee at the mention of his name, standing alone in a throne room built on blood and terror. Duke Cassian Dravenmore ruled the kingdom of Valadorn like a wolf commands its hunting ground. Absolute, merciless, untouchable. But power has a dark side nobody talks about. The strongest ruler in the north is about to learn that the real war isn't fought with swords. It's fought in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. In the moment when everything you built starts crumbling because of one woman who refused to bow. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. This is going to get brutal. The winter wind screamed against the black marble towers of Ravenwyke Fortress like it was trying to claw its way inside. Snow piled against the outer walls 3 feet deep, covering the courtyard where Cassian Dravenmore had executed 7 men the previous month for conspiracy. Their families still whispered about it in the lower districts. Quick deaths, they said, almost merciful by the Duke's standards. Cassian stood before the massive arched windows of his private chambers, watching the storm tear across the northern territories. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Dark hair swept back from sharp features, jaw carved from stone, eyes the color of steel just before it meets the forge. 34 years old and already a legend people told their children about to make them behave. The fireplace roared behind him, throwing shadows across tapestries depicting ancient victories. Gold thread caught the light, illustrating dead kings claiming territories that would eventually fall to dust like everything else. Cassian had learned that lesson early. Power was the only thing that mattered. Power and the will to use it without hesitation. A knock interrupted his thoughts. 3 sharp raps. His steward. "Come in." The door opened with barely a sound. Marcus Thorne entered, silver-haired and impeccably dressed despite the late hour. The old man had served Cassian's father and somehow survived the brutal transition when Cassian took control of Ravenwyke 8 years ago. Survival required intelligence. Marcus possessed it in abundance. "Your Grace, Lady Seraphine has arrived. The guards have escorted her to the east wing as you instructed." Cassian turned from the window. "Good. Make sure she understands the terms of her residence here. Her father's debts are considerable. She remains until they're settled in full." Marcus hesitated. A rare occurrence. "Of course, Your Grace. Should I inform her of the timeline?" "There is no timeline. Lord Edmund Vale gambled away 3 estates and borrowed against holdings he didn't own. The man's a fool. His daughter pays the price for his stupidity." The steward nodded and withdrew, leaving Cassian alone with thoughts that felt heavier than they should. He'd taken collateral before, seized properties, imprisoned debtors, ruined entire family lines to make examples of weakness. This should have been routine, but Edmund Vale's daughter carried a reputation that preceded her arrival. Lady Seraphine Vale, 26 years old, educated in literature and philosophy at the Cathedral Academy before her family's fortune collapsed. Known throughout the Southern Territories for her refusal to marry any of the wealthy merchants who'd offered to rescue her father from bankruptcy. The rumors painted her as proud, stubborn, possibly delusional about her diminished status. Cassian had reviewed the reports 3 times. Something about the situation felt off, like a mechanism with one gear slightly misaligned. Noble daughters facing destitution usually married quickly or disappeared into convents. They didn't walk into the fortress of Valadorn's most feared duke as collateral for debt. Either she was brave or she had no idea what Ravenwyke really was. He'd find out soon enough. Seraphine stood in the center of her assigned chambers, examining the space with the careful attention of someone mapping escape routes. The room was larger than her family's entire remaining estate. Velvet curtains the color of deep wine framed windows that overlooked the inner courtyard. The bed could sleep 4 people comfortably. A fireplace dominated the north wall, already blazing with heat that drove back the winter cold. It was a gilded cage, and she understood exactly what it represented. Her maid Clara hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands like she expected executioners to burst in at any moment. "My lady, perhaps we should unpack." Seraphine moved to the trunk containing her few remaining possessions. "Running won't help. The Duke controls every road out of the northern territories. We're here because my father's an irresponsible gambler who thought he could outplay professionals. Now we deal with the consequences." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say terrible things about Duke Dravenmore. That he killed his own cousin for questioning his authority. That he once had a merchant flayed alive for stories." Seraphine pulled out a simple gray dress and laid it across the bed. Powerful men attract rumors like corpses attract flies. Most of it's exaggeration designed to keep people afraid. And if it's not, then we'll be very, very careful. The truth was, Seraphine had spent the 3-day journey to Ravenwyke researching everything available about Cassian Dravenmore. The man was brutal, calculating, and apparently incapable of mercy. He'd seized control of the northern territories after his father's death, in circumstances that remained suspiciously unclear. The former duke had supposedly fallen from his horse during a hunting expedition. No witnesses. Convenient timing right before he planned to name Cassian's younger brother as heir. The younger brother died 6 months later. Hunting accident. Same hunting grounds. Cassian Dravenmore built his reputation on fear because fear was efficient. It eliminated opposition before opposition could organize. It turned potential enemies into cowering servants who'd betray their own families for a chance at survival. Seraphine understood the game. She just refused to play by his rules. A sharp knock interrupted her unpacking. Clara jumped like she'd been struck. The door opened before either of them could respond. A man entered who radiated authority like heat from a furnace. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. His face could have been carved from the same marble as the fortress walls. All sharp angles and controlled aggression. Duke Cassian Dravenmore studied her with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Lady Seraphine, his voice matched his appearance. Low, controlled, dangerous. I trust your accommodations are acceptable. Seraphine met his gaze directly. She didn't curtsy, didn't lower her eyes. The room is generous, Your Grace. Far more comfortable than I expected for a prisoner. Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe. Or anger. You're not a prisoner. You're a guest whose departure is temporarily inconvenient. Semantics. I'm here against my will because my father's debts give you legal claim over me until they're satisfied. That's imprisonment with better furniture. Cassian moved deeper into the room with the fluid grace of a predator circling prey. Clara made a small sound of terror and retreated toward the door. The Duke ignored her completely, his attention locked on Seraphine like she was a puzzle he intended to solve through force if necessary. Most people fear me, Lady Seraphine. They see the power I wield and understand that defiance results in consequences. You seem to lack that basic survival instinct. Or perhaps I simply refuse to grovel before someone who's never earned my respect through anything except inherited privilege and strategic cruelty. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Clara whimpered. Cassian stopped 3 feet from Seraphine, close enough that she could see the gray flecks in his steel-colored eyes, close enough to understand that he could snap her neck before she took another breath. But she didn't step back, didn't flinch. Careful. His voice went even quieter, softer, infinitely more threatening. You're clever enough to know that words have prices in Ravenwyke. Every insult is noted, every challenge remembered. I've destroyed men for less than what you just said. Then destroy me! Seraphine's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. Execute me for honesty and prove that every terrible story told about the Iron Duke is completely accurate. Show the kingdom that Cassian Dravenmore is exactly the monster everyone believes him to be. For 5 seconds that felt like hours, nobody moved. The fire crackled, wind rattled the windows. Clara's breathing sounded like she was suffocating. Then Cassian did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the expression of a chess player who just realized his opponent knew how to play the game after all. Dangerous. Intrigued. Almost impressed. You're either exceptionally brave or suicidally stupid. I haven't decided which. Does it matter? Yes. His eyes held hers. Because brave women are useful. Stupid ones are liabilities I eliminate. He turned and walked toward the door with the same controlled precision he'd used entering. At the threshold, he paused without looking back. Dinner is served at 8 in the main hall. You'll attend. Wear something appropriate for court. We have guests who expect certain standards even from collateral. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Clara collapsed into the nearest chair, face pale as fresh snow. My lady, you cannot speak to him that way. He'll kill you. He'll kill both of us. Seraphine's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide the tremor. He won't. Not yet, anyway. Men like Cassian Dravenmore don't respect fear. They expect it. But respect? That's different. That requires being someone worth remembering instead of just another terrified subject bowing and scraping. You're gambling with our lives. Yes. Seraphine moved to the window, staring out at the fortress that would be her prison for however long the Duke decided. I am, because the alternative is spending however many months or years here as a ghost, invisible and powerless. At least this way he sees me. What if he decides he doesn't like what he sees? Then we'll find out exactly how creative the Iron Duke's punishments really are. In fact, the main hall of Ravenwick could hold 300 people when fully occupied. Tonight it hosted perhaps 40. Lords and ladies from allied houses, dressed in silks and jewels that cost more than most commoners earned in a lifetime. They moved through the space like actors in a play everyone had memorized, speaking in carefully modulated tones about nothing that mattered. Seraphine entered through the massive oak doors with Clara trailing 3 steps behind. Every head turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The sudden attention felt like being examined under glass by a committee of executioners trying to decide the most entertaining method of disposal. She'd chosen a dress in deep emerald that had belonged to her mother. Simple by court standards, no jewels or excessive ornamentation, but it fit perfectly and made her dark hair seem even darker against her pale skin. She held her head high and walked toward the Duke's table like she had every right to be there. Cassian sat at the head of a long table that could seat 20. To his right was a woman Seraphine didn't recognize, blonde, beautiful in an ice sculpture way, dripping diamonds. To his left sat an elderly man with silver hair and the calculating eyes of someone who'd survived decades of court politics through superior intelligence. The Duke watched Seraphine approach. His expression revealed nothing. She stopped at the appropriate distance and executed a curtsy so minimal it barely qualified. Your Grace, Lady Seraphine, Cassian gestured to an empty chair 6 seats down on his left. Please, join us. It was a test. Taking that seat meant accepting her position at the absolute lowest tier of the social hierarchy present. Everyone at this table outranked her by birth, wealth, or both. Refusing would be open defiance. Seraphine moved to the indicated chair and sat without comment. A servant immediately appeared to pour wine. The blonde woman leaned forward slightly, examining Seraphine with the kind of attention usually reserved for unusual insects. So you're the Vale daughter. I've heard interesting stories. Your family used to control 3 estates in the Southern Territories, didn't they? Before your father developed his unfortunate gambling habits. 2 estates. Seraphine kept her voice pleasant. And my father's habits are his concern, not mine, lady. Vivian Ashcroft. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. My family controls the western trade routes. We've had dealings with the Vales in the past. Always so proud, your father. Even when he was losing everything. Pride is expensive. Seraphine sipped her wine. I prefer practical survival. How refreshing. Lady Vivian's tone suggested she found nothing about Seraphine refreshing. Most noble daughters in your position would be weeping into their pillows, praying for rescue. You seem remarkably composed for a woman whose entire future depends on the Duke's mercy. The Duke has many qualities. Seraphine glanced toward Cassian, who was listening without apparent interest. I suspect mercy ranks quite low on the list. Several people inhaled sharply. Lady Vivian's eyes widened. The elderly man to Cassian's left, who Seraphine now recognized as Chancellor Octavian Reeve, the Duke's most trusted advisor, set down his wine glass with deliberate care. Cassian's expression never changed. Lady Seraphine values honesty above diplomacy, Chancellor. A rare trait in Ravenwyke. Dangerous trait, Your Grace. Octavian's voice carried the weight of long experience. Honesty without wisdom is just another form of foolishness. Then perhaps we should celebrate foolishness more often. Seraphine met the Chancellor's gaze directly. I found that wisdom usually means saying what powerful people want to hear rather than what's true. That kind of wisdom seems particularly worthless. The silence that followed could have frozen water. Cassian leaned back in his chair, watching Seraphine with an expression that might have been fascination or might have been the look a scientist gives a specimen before dissection. You believe truth has value even when it results in punishment? I believe truth is the only thing that has value. Everything else is performance. And if the truth offends those who hold power over your life, then they're weak rulers who require lies to maintain control. Lady Vivian made a choking sound. Chancellor Octavian's face hardened into something that promised future consequences. Half the nobles at the table looked like they expected Cassian to draw his sword and execute Seraphine between courses. Instead, the Duke smiled. Not the calculated smile from earlier. Something closer to genuine amusement. You have unusual courage for someone in your position, Lady Seraphine. Courage is just fear that learned to walk upright, Your Grace. The conversation shifted after that, moving to safer topics. Trade negotiations, upcoming festivals, the mild winter and what it might mean for spring harvests. Seraphine participated minimally, answering when directly addressed, but otherwise observing the complex dance of court politics playing out around her. She noticed things. The way Lady Vivian kept touching Cassian's arm, claiming his attention with practiced ease. The way the Chancellor watched everyone at the table like a master strategist playing multiple games simultaneously. The way younger nobles deferred to older ones with the automatic reflex of people who'd been trained since birth in the proper hierarchy. And she noticed how Cassian never quite looked away from her for more than a few seconds. After dinner, as guests dispersed toward the drawing rooms for drinks and gossip, Cassian intercepted Seraphine in the corridor outside the main hall. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Seraphine nodded to Clara, who retreated with visible relief and fell into step beside the Duke as he led her through Ravenwyke's maze of corridors. They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps echoing off stone walls decorated with portraits of dead rulers who all seemed to be glaring down in judgment. Cassian moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every inch of his territory, who'd walked these halls so many times that navigation required no conscious thought. He stopped beside a series of tall windows overlooking the western courtyard. Snow fell in heavy curtains, accumulating on the frozen fountains that wouldn't run again until spring. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lady Seraphine." She joined him at the window. "Am I? You insult my chancellor. You challenge my authority in front of witnesses. You refuse to show the deference your position requires. Either you're testing boundaries, or you genuinely don't understand how Ravenwyke functions. Perhaps I understand perfectly and simply refuse to participate in a system built on fear and submission." Cassian turned to face her directly. The moonlight coming through the windows carved his features into something almost otherworldly, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Fear maintains order. Submission prevents chaos. I've ruled these territories for 8 years without rebellion or significant unrest. That stability exists because people understand consequences. You're asking me to abandon the foundation of everything I've built. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. Seraphine held his gaze. I'm refusing to pretend that ruling through terror is the same thing as earning genuine loyalty. Your people obey you because they're terrified. The moment someone stronger appears, they'll abandon you without hesitation. That's not power. That's borrowed time. His expression hardened. And what would you suggest as an alternative? Love? Respect? Those are luxuries weak rulers rely on before they're overthrown. Those are foundations strong rulers build kingdoms on. Fear is efficient short-term. It crumbles eventually. Always. You speak from extensive experience ruling territories, I assume? I speak from watching my father destroy everything our family built through arrogance and short-sighted selfishness. He thought he was invincible right up until the moment he lost everything. Pride and power without wisdom is just a slow-motion collapse. Something shifted in Cassian's eyes. Not softening exactly, more like recognition. Your father's failings don't qualify you to judge mine. No, but they qualify me to recognize them. For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the wind howling against the ancient stone. When Cassian spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, almost contemplative. "You mistake my patience for kindness, Lady Seraphine." "No, Your Grace. I mistake your loneliness for power." The words hit like a physical blow. Cassian's entire body went rigid. His hands, resting loosely at his sides, curled into fists. The temperature seemed to plummet. "You overstep." "Do I?" Seraphine's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "You surround yourself with people who fear you too much to be honest. Your chancellor manipulates you with advice designed to maintain his own influence. Lady Vivian wants your title and wealth, not you. Every noble in that dining hall would celebrate your death if they thought they could survive the aftermath. You've built an empire of terror and called it strength, but you're completely alone inside it. That's not power, that's imprisonment." Cassian moved so fast she barely registered the motion. Suddenly he was directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. close enough to see the fury in something else, something raw and unguarded, burning in his eyes. "You know nothing about me. I know you killed your father." Seraphine didn't move, didn't retreat. "I know you eliminated your younger brother when he became a threat. I know you've executed, imprisoned, or destroyed anyone who challenged your authority. And I know that despite all that power, despite controlling the entire northern territories, you stand here arguing with a disgraced noble daughter because some part of you is desperate for someone, anyone, to see past the monster you've become." His hand shot out and gripped her chin, forcing her to maintain eye contact. His touch was firm enough to hurt, not enough to bruise. "Yet, I could kill you right now. Snap your neck and throw your body from these windows. No one would question it. No one would care. Then do it." Her voice shook slightly, but she kept talking. "Prove that everything I said is true. Prove that the Iron Duke is nothing but violence and fear wrapped in expensive clothes. Kill me and go back to your empty throne surrounded by people who hate you." For 10 heartbeats, she genuinely believed he might do it. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the dark instinct that had helped him seize power and hold it through sheer, ruthless will. Then his hand dropped. He stepped back, and the expression on his face was something Seraphine had never seen before. Confusion, uncertainty. Like a man who just discovered that the weapon he'd relied on for years suddenly refused to function. "Get out!" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Return to your chambers. Now." Seraphine didn't argue. She walked past him, forcing herself to maintain a steady pace despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She made it to the corridor junction before her legs started shaking badly enough that she had to lean against the wall. What had she done? She'd just accused the most dangerous man in Valadorn of being lonely and broken. She'd stripped away the careful facade he'd built and forced him to confront truths he'd probably spent years burying. Either she'd just made the worst mistake of her life, or she'd done the only thing that might actually save it. Time would tell which. Cassian remained at the window long after Seraphine disappeared into the depths of Ravenwyke. His hand still tingled where he'd touched her. His pulse hammered in his ears like battle drums. She was right. Every single word she'd said was absolutely, devastatingly correct. He had killed his father, staged it to look like an accident because patricide, even when justified, carried consequences that outright execution avoided. His father had been weak, indecisive, willing to split the territories among multiple heirs in a gesture of fairness that would have sparked civil war within a generation. Cassian had prevented that war. The cost was his father's life and any remaining illusion that mercy had a place in Ravenwyke. His brother had been next. Younger, more charismatic, more interested in parties and hunts than governance. The nobles loved him, would have supported his claim, would have torn the territories apart fighting over the scraps after his inevitable failure as a ruler. Cassian eliminated the problem before it metastasized. Another hunting accident? Tragic. Suspicious to anyone paying attention. Never proven. And every execution since, every brutal demonstration of power, every decision that prioritized control over compassion, all of it designed to prevent challenges before they formed. He'd built an empire on corpses and called it success. And he'd done it completely alone. Because trust was weakness, affection was vulnerability. Love was the fastest path to destruction for any ruler who wanted to keep his throne. Octavian had taught him that, drilled it into him from the moment Cassian's father died. A ruler who seeks love loses his kingdom. A ruler who seeks fear keeps it forever. The philosophy had served Cassian well for 8 years, until a disgraced noble daughter walked into his fortress and looked at him like he was a man instead of a monument to terror. He'd wanted to kill her in that moment. The instinct was pure, immediate, the same dark urge that had helped him survive countless assassination attempts and political betrayals. Eliminate the threat, erase the problem, move forward without hesitation. But another part of him, a part he'd thought dead years ago, wanted something different, wanted her to keep talking, keep challenging, keep refusing to bow before power like everyone else in his miserable court. That part terrified him more than any army ever could. Footsteps approached from behind. Cassian didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Your Grace." Chancellor Octavian's voice carried its usual measured calm. "Forgive the intrusion. I thought we should discuss Lady Seraphine's behavior this evening. What about it? She's dangerous." The Chancellor moved to stand beside Cassian at the window. not in the traditional sense, but she challenges your authority in front of witnesses, plants seeds of doubt, makes you appear uncertain. That kind of erosion is subtle, deadly. It must be addressed before it spreads. Addressed how? She could be relocated, sent to one of the outer holdings where her influence would be minimal. Or if you prefer a more permanent solution. No. The word came out harder than Cassian intended. She stays. Here. Under my direct supervision. Octavian was quiet for a moment. May I speak freely, Your Grace? When have you ever required permission? A slight smile touched the Chancellor's lips. You're intrigued by her. I understand the attraction. She's clever, bold, different from the simpering nobles who populate your court. But intrigue is a luxury you cannot afford. Every moment you spend considering her words is a moment your enemies use to strengthen their positions. Lord Malric has been meeting with the border houses. Lady Ashcroft's family is consolidating trade routes in ways that reduce your economic leverage. The foundations are shifting, then I'll reinforce them. How? By engaging in philosophical debates with a woman whose family's disgrace makes her worthless as an ally? By allowing insults to your authority to pass without consequences? You've built Ravenwyke on unshakable strength. The moment you appear human, appear vulnerable, appear weak, everything collapses. Cassian turned to face the Chancellor directly. You think mercy is weakness? I know it is. I've watched strong rulers fall because they prioritized hearts over strategy. Your father died because he couldn't make hard decisions. Your brother would have destroyed the territories through incompetence wrapped in charm. You survive because you understand that power requires sacrifice, personal desires, emotional attachments. All of it must be subordinated to maintaining control. And if I'm tired of sacrificing, Octavian's expression never wavered. Then you'll lose everything you fought to build. Empires don't run on tired rulers, Your Grace. They require absolute commitment, always. The Chancellor bowed and withdrew, leaving Cassian alone with thoughts that felt like they were tearing him in multiple directions simultaneously. He could execute Seraphine tomorrow, stage it as punishment for disrespect. No one would question it. Lady Vivian would be thrilled. The court would whisper for a while and then forget. Problem solved. Weakness eliminated. Order maintained. But the thought made something cold and heavy settle in his chest. Because Seraphine wasn't wrong. He was lonely. Desperately, comprehensively alone inside a fortress full of people who feared him too much to be real. And for the first time in 8 years, Cassian Dravenmore wondered if the price of his throne was actually worth paying. But 3 days passed. Seraphine attended dinners where she spoke minimally and observed constantly. She noticed the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined Ravenwyke's court. Lord Malric controlled the eastern border houses and commanded significant military resources. Lady Vivian's trade networks gave her economic influence that rivaled the Duke's official tax revenues. Smaller noble families orbited these power centers like moons around planets, shifting loyalties based on perceived advantage. And through it all, Cassian ruled with the same iron control that had earned his title. His decisions were swift, absolute, immune to appeal. When a merchant was caught smuggling contraband through the northern territories, the Duke had him publicly flogged and his goods seized. When two nobles nearly came to blows over a border dispute, Cassian resolved it by confiscating the disputed land from both parties and adding it to his own holdings. Fear maintained order. Everyone understood consequences, but Seraphine also noticed cracks in the facade. The way Cassian's hand tightened around his wineglass when Octavian whispered advice during meals. The way his eyes tracked her movements even when he appeared focused elsewhere. The way he'd excused himself early from the past 2 dinners, disappearing into Ravenwyke's depths without explanation. Something was shifting. She could feel it the way animals sense approaching storms. On the 4th night, a servant delivered a message to her chambers. The Duke requested her presence in his private study. Immediately. Clara nearly fainted. My lady, please. Whatever you said to him, apologize. Beg forgiveness. Don't. I'll be fine. Seraphine wasn't certain she believed that, but appearing terrified would only make things worse. Wait here. If I'm not back by midnight, assume the worst and try to reach the southern territories before winter closes the roads completely. She followed the servant through corridors she'd never seen before, deeper into Ravenwyke's private sections where only the Duke and his closest advisors were permitted. The walls here were bare stone, undecorated, functional. This was the fortress's true heart, where real business happened away from the performative theater of the main halls. The study door was heavy oak reinforced with iron. The servant knocked twice and withdrew without waiting for response. Enter. Seraphine pushed open the door and stepped into a room that was somehow both exactly what she expected and completely surprising. Massive desk covered in maps and correspondence. Walls lined with books, not decorative volumes but working texts with cracked spines and dog-eared pages. A fireplace large enough to stand in. Windows overlooking the northern cliffs where the fortress dropped away to sheer rock faces that plunged hundreds of feet to the valley below. Cassian stood at those windows silhouetted against moonlight and falling snow. Close the door. She obeyed. The lock clicked with a finality that sent ice down her spine. The Duke didn't turn around. 3 days ago, you accused me of being lonely, of building an empire of fear because I'm incapable of anything else. Do you remember? Yes, Your Grace. I've spent those 3 days considering whether to have you executed for the insult. The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Seraphine's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to speak. And have you decided? Cassian turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. I've decided that you're either the most perceptive person in Ravenwyke, or you're extraordinarily lucky at guessing. Either way, you've presented me with a problem I don't know how to solve. What problem? You. He moved away from the windows, circling toward her with that predatory grace. You refuse to be afraid. You challenge me openly. You see things I've spent years hiding, and despite every rational calculation suggesting I should eliminate you as a threat to my authority, I find myself wanting to know what you'll say next. That's dangerous. For both of us. Truth is always dangerous, Your Grace. Lies are safer, easier. They let powerful people sleep at night, believing their own propaganda. If you want me to start lying, I can. I'll bow and scrape and tell you how magnificent and wise you are, but we'll both know it's performance. Is that really what you want? No. The admission seemed to cost him something, but I also can't allow open defiance to go unpunished. The court watches everything. They're looking for weakness. Any crack in the foundation. If I let you insult my chancellor without consequences, if I permit challenges to my authority, I invite rebellion. Then punish me. Make an example. Show them the Iron Duke doesn't tolerate disrespect. I've considered it. Cassian stopped directly in front of her. Close enough to touch. Close enough to kill. But executing you would prove you right. It would demonstrate that I'm exactly the monster you described. A man so threatened by honesty that he destroys it rather than face it. So we're at an impasse. No. His voice dropped lower. Softer. More dangerous than when he was shouting. We're at a decision point. I can continue ruling exactly as I have for 8 years. Maintain control through fear. Keep everyone at distance. Die old and powerful and completely alone. Or I can try something different. Take a risk. Allow one person to see past the performance and maybe, discover whether there's anything underneath worth salvaging. The vulnerability in that statement was more shocking than any threat could have been. Seraphine's heart hammered against her ribs. What are you asking me? I'm asking if you're willing to help me become something other than what I am. Knowing it might fail, knowing the court will fight it, knowing it could destroy us both. Why me? Because you're the only person in this entire fortress who treats me like a man instead of a title. The only one who isn't calculating how to use me for advantage. And because... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally. Because when you look at me, I see possibility instead of fear. I don't know what to do with that, but I want to find out. Seraphine studied his face, searching for deception and finding only raw honesty that seemed completely out of place on the Duke's brutal features. This is insane, you realize that. Completely. Your chancellor will oppose it. The entire court will see it as weakness. I know. And there's no guarantee it works. I might help you become slightly less terrible, and we both might die in the process. A distinct possibility. Then why risk it? Because the alternative is spending the rest of my life as a monument to fear while slowly going mad from isolation. I've achieved everything I set out to accomplish. I control more territory than any duke in 3 generations. I've eliminated every significant threat to my power. And I've never been more miserable. If that's success, it's worthless. The raw pain in those words struck something deep in Seraphine's chest. She should refuse, should recognize this as manipulation, should understand that powerful men didn't change, They just found more sophisticated ways to control people. But she'd seen his face when she called him lonely, had watched something crack behind his eyes in that moment by the window. This wasn't strategy. This was desperation from a man who'd finally realized his empire was also his prison. "I'll help you." The words came out before she fully processed the decision. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, no more executions without legitimate cause. Fear works until it doesn't. Then it breeds rebellion. If you want respect instead of terror, start by not killing people for minor offenses." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Some offenses require... Find another way. Exile, imprisonment, public humiliation if necessary. But casual execution as policy stops now." A long pause. "Agreed. What else?" "Second, you listen when I tell you the court is manipulating you. I don't expect you to automatically agree with me, but you at least consider that your advisors might have motivations beyond your best interests." "Including Octavian?" "Especially Octavian." Seraphine held his gaze. "He's built his entire position on keeping you isolated and paranoid. The moment you start trusting anyone else, his influence diminishes. He'll fight this, probably try to destroy me in the process." Cassian nodded slowly. "Third condition? You have to want this. Actually want to change. Not just tolerate my presence because it's interesting. If this is just entertainment, if you're planning to discard me the moment I become inconvenient, tell me now so I can plan accordingly." For several heartbeats, Cassian said nothing. Then he extended his hand, the gesture formal and binding in a way words alone couldn't match. "I want to change. I don't know if I can, but I want to try." Seraphine took his hand. His grip was firm, calloused from sword practice, warm despite the winter cold permeating the study. "Then we have an agreement, Your Grace." Cassian. His expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of a genuine smile. "If we're doing this, you should probably use my actual name." "Very well." Cassian. The name felt strange in her mouth. Too personal. Too human for someone who'd been the Iron Duke in every thought and conversation since she'd arrived. He released her hand but didn't step back. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to navigate a court full of people who will absolutely try to kill us both for this." "Looking forward to it." The sarcasm was unexpected, almost playful. Seraphine found herself smiling, despite the absolute insanity of everything that had just happened. "You're going to regret this decision," she said. "Probably. But at least I won't be bored." They stood in silence for a moment, the fireplace crackling, snow falling beyond the windows. Two people who'd just agreed to attempt something that would either save them both or destroy everything Cassian had built. Somewhere in Ravenwake's depths, Chancellor Octavian was likely already planning how to eliminate this new threat to his carefully maintained influence. Somewhere in the noble quarters, Lord Malric and Lady Vivian were probably scheming about how to exploit any perceived weakness in the Duke's armor. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fortress walls, forces neither of them yet understood were moving into position. But in that moment, in Cassian's private study with firelight dancing across ancient stone, Seraphine felt something she hadn't experienced since her family's collapse. Hope. Dangerous. Fragile. Possibly doomed. But real. That's it. The next morning, Duke Cassian Dravenmore made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Ravenwick's entire power structure. Lady Seraphine Vale was being elevated from collateral to official advisor on matters of governance and court relations. She would attend all council meetings. Her counsel would be sought on significant decisions, and any disrespect shown to her would be treated as disrespect to the Duke himself. The decree was absolute, non-negotiable, already sealed with the Duke's authority. Chancellor Octavian's face remained perfectly neutral as the announcement was read. Lady Vivian's wine glass shattered in her hand. Lord Malric excused himself from breakfast early, citing urgent business in the Eastern Territories. And throughout Ravenwyke Fortress, in corridors and chambers and secret meeting rooms, the whispers began. The Iron Duke had a weakness now. And weakness, in a place built on fear and power, was blood in the water. The announcement rippled through Ravenwyke like poison spreading through bloodstream. By noon, every servant knew. By evening, the entire Northern Territories had heard. Duke Cassian Dravenmore had elevated a disgraced noble daughter to advisor status. The Iron Duke, who'd ruled through fear and isolation for 8 years, had just publicly declared that someone else's opinion mattered. The court reacted exactly as Seraphine had predicted, with knives hidden behind silk smiles. She sat in her chambers while Clara paced frantically, wringing her hands like she was trying to squeeze water from stone. "My lady, this is madness. You've painted a target on yourself. Every noble in this fortress wants you dead now. They wanted me dead yesterday." Seraphine reviewed the stack of documents Cassian had sent over. Council minutes from the past 6 months, trade agreements, border dispute resolutions, tax collection reports. Nothing classified, but enough to understand how Ravenwick actually functioned beneath the theatrical displays of power. Now they're just more motivated about it. This isn't a joke. Lady Vivian controls half the trade routes in the Northern Territories. Lord Malric commands 3,000 soldiers. Chancellor Octavian has been the Duke's closest advisor since before you were born. Any one of them could destroy you without breaking stride. So could Cassian, but he chose not to. Seraphine set down a particularly dense contract involving grain shipments and looked directly at her maid. "I know you're scared. I'm terrified. But walking away now means we lose everything. At least this way we have a chance. A chance at what? Getting your throat cut in the middle of the night? At changing something that desperately needs changing. This place runs on fear and manipulation. People die because showing mercy looks weak. Alliances form and collapse based on who's most ruthless. That's not governance. That's barely controlled chaos waiting for the right spark to explode. And you think one woman with no real power can fix centuries of brutal tradition? No. But one woman might convince a very powerful duke that there's another way. That's worth the risk. Clara stopped pacing. Her voice dropped to barely above whisper. "You're falling for him." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Seraphine wanted to deny it reflexively, wanted to explain that this was strategy, survival instinct, calculated risk, based on reading Cassian's psychological vulnerabilities. But the words stuck in her throat because they'd be lies. Something had shifted during that conversation in his study, when he'd admitted to being miserable despite achieving everything, when he'd asked for help with the kind of raw vulnerability that powerful men weren't supposed to possess. She'd seen past the monster everyone else feared and glimpsed someone desperately trying not to drown in isolation of his own creation. That was dangerous in ways assassination attempts could never match. "I'm trying to survive." That was true if incomplete. Everything else is secondary. Clara's expression suggested she didn't believe that for a second, but she was smart enough not to push. A knock interrupted before either of them could continue. The door opened without waiting for permission. A young man in the Duke's colors stood at attention, clearly nervous about entering a lady's private chambers uninvited. "Lady Seraphine, His Grace requests your presence in the council chamber. The morning session begins in 20 minutes. This was it. The first real test. Walking into a room full of people who viewed her as either threat or opportunity, none of whom wanted her there, all of whom had decades more experience navigating court politics. Seraphine stood and smoothed her dress. Dark blue today, simple cut, no jewelry. Looking wealthy would make her a target. Looking weak would invite attacks. She needed to project competence without arrogance. "Tell His Grace I'll be there shortly." The messenger bowed and withdrew. Clara immediately started fussing with Seraphine's hair, trying to arrange it into something more formal. "My lady, please be careful. Don't trust anyone in that room, especially the Chancellor. I wouldn't trust him if he was the last person in Valadorn." "Good, because he's probably already planning how to get rid of you." The council chamber was smaller than Seraphine expected. Circular room, high ceiling, dominated by a round table that could seat perhaps 15 people. Windows overlooked the eastern courtyard where guards drilled in formation, their movements precise despite the cold. 8 people were already present when she entered. Cassian sat at the table's head, reviewing documents with the same intense focus he probably applied to battlefield strategy. Chancellor Octavian occupied the seat to his right, silver hair perfectly arranged, eyes missing nothing. Lady Vivian sat 3 chairs down, dressed in emerald silk that probably cost more than Seraphine's entire remaining wardrobe. Lord Malric held the opposite side, flanked by 2 younger nobles Seraphine didn't recognize. Every head turned when she entered. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cassian looked up. "Lady Seraphine, please." He gestured to an empty chair directly to his left. The position of honor, the seat traditionally reserved for the Duke's closest advisor or heir. Octavian's expression never changed, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Seraphine moved to the indicated chair and sat, acutely aware of every gaze tracking her movement. "Thank you, Your Grace. We were just reviewing the eastern border situation." Cassian's tone was purely professional. "Lord Malric, please continue." Malric was probably 50, built like someone who'd spent decades in armor, scarred face suggesting he'd survived battles that killed better men. He looked at Seraphine like she was an insect that had wandered into a wolf den. As I was saying before the interruption, the border houses report increased bandit activity. Trade caravans attacked. Supply routes disrupted. They're requesting additional military support. "How many attacks?" Seraphine asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. Several people inhaled sharply. Malric's face hardened. "I'm sorry, did someone address you?" Cassian's voice cut through the tension. "Lady Seraphine is my advisor. Her questions carry my authority. Answer her." Malric's jaw clenched, but he complied. 7 attacks in the past month, 12 casualties, approximately 40,000 in stolen goods. Seraphine pulled the trade report she'd studied toward her. "And how many of those caravans were carrying goods from houses that oppose your territorial expansion proposals?" The silence that followed could have frozen blood. Malric leaned forward slowly. "Are you accusing me of orchestrating bandit attacks? I'm asking if there's correlation between political opposition and suddenly vulnerable trade routes. That seems like relevant information before committing military resources." "You arrogant little—" "Enough." Cassian's voice cracked like a whip. "Lord Malric, the question is legitimate. Do we have evidence these attacks are random or targeted?" The military commander's face flushed dark red. "With all due respect, Your Grace, I've served this fortress for 23 years. I don't need some disgraced noble brat questioning my integrity based on a day's worth of reading reports she doesn't understand. Then explain it to me." Seraphine kept her voice level. "Help me understand why houses that disagree with your expansion plans are suffering disproportionate losses." "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." Chancellor Octavian spoke for the first time, his tone measured and deadly. "Lady Seraphine raises an interesting point, Lord Malric, though her delivery lacks the diplomatic finesse one might expect from an experienced advisor. Perhaps we should examine the attack patterns more carefully before allocating resources." It was a masterful move, appearing to support her question while simultaneously emphasizing her inexperience and lack of diplomatic skill, undermining her credibility while seeming reasonable. Cassian caught it immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. "The Chancellor is correct. Lord Malric, have detailed reports prepared showing attack locations, affected houses, and cargo manifests. We'll review them before making decisions about troop deployment." Malric looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the dismissal. "As you command, Your Grace." The meeting continued for another hour. Border disputes, tax collection efficiency, proposed trade agreements with southern territories. Seraphine participated minimally, asking occasional questions designed to expose inconsistencies rather than challenge authority directly. She noticed patterns. The way Octavian and Vivian exchanged glances when Cassian mentioned reducing execution quotas. The way younger nobles deferred to Malric on anything involving military resources. The way information seemed to flow through invisible channels, everyone knowing things that shouldn't have left closed meetings. Ravenwick's court wasn't just corrupt. It was organized corruption with systems and hierarchies more complex than the official governance structure. When Cassian finally dismissed the council, Octavian lingered. "Your Grace, might I have a moment?" "Of course, Chancellor." Seraphine started to leave, but Cassian's voice stopped her. "Stay. Anything the Chancellor wishes to discuss can be said in front of my advisor." Octavian's smile never reached his eyes. "As you wish." "Your Grace, I wanted to express concern about this morning's session." Lady Seraphine's questions, while showing admirable initiative, created unnecessary tension with Lord Malric. The military houses are already skeptical about changes to long-standing policies. Appearing to question their loyalty could have serious consequences. She questioned correlation, not loyalty. Cassian's tone remained neutral. "That's what advisors do." "Of course. But inexperienced advisors sometimes fail to recognize when their questions undermine carefully maintained alliances. Lord Malric is proud. He won't forget being challenged in front of the council, and he commands significant resources that we need stable and cooperative. Then perhaps Lord Malric should ensure his actions don't create questions about correlation between political opposition and convenient bandit attacks. Seraphine met the Chancellor's gaze directly. If everything is legitimate, detailed reports will prove that. If not, we've identified a problem that needs addressing. You assume malice where inefficiency is more likely. Octavian's voice carried the patient condescension of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Border security is complicated. Bandit activity fluctuates based on weather, harvest cycles, troop positioning. Drawing conclusions from limited data is how inexperienced advisors create political disasters, and ignoring patterns is how experienced advisors maintain corruption that serves their interests. The words came out harder than Seraphine intended. I apologize if asking questions disrupts the comfortable status quo. But if that status quo includes organized theft disguised as random attacks, maybe disruption is exactly what's needed. The Chancellor's expression never changed, but something cold and final settled into his eyes, like a judge passing sentence. Your Grace. He turns to Cassian. I've served your family for 32 years, helped your father stabilize the territories after the succession wars, guided you through the difficult transition after his death. I've always acted in Ravenwyck's best interests. But I cannot effectively advise you if my counsel is constantly undermined by someone with no experience and no understanding of the delicate balances we've spent decades building. It was an ultimatum delivered with perfect politeness. Choose between me and her. Cassian stood, moving to the windows overlooking the courtyard. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched guards drilling in precise formations below. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, absolutely certain. Chancellor, your service has been invaluable. But if the delicate balances you've spent decades building require suppressing legitimate questions and protecting corruption, then perhaps those balances need to collapse. Octavian's face went completely blank. Your Grace, you're dismissed, Chancellor. Thank you for your concern. It was the most polite version of go to hell Seraphine had ever heard. The Chancellor bowed stiffly and left without another word. The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt more threatening than a slam. The moment they were alone, Cassian turned to face Seraphine. That was incredibly reckless. I know. Octavian is the most politically connected person in this fortress. He knows where everybody is buried because he probably helped bury half of them. You just made an enemy who will dedicate every resource to destroying you. I know. Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. But he gave you an ultimatum. If you'd backed down, every other advisor would know they can force your hand by threatening to quit. You would have looked weak, and now I look like I'm willing to sacrifice experienced counsel for a woman I've known less than 2 weeks. That also looks weak. It looks like you're willing to make hard choices instead of being manipulated. Seraphine moved closer, lowering her voice. He wanted you to choose him because he assumed you would, because you always have before. But if you want things to change, if you actually meant what you said about trying something different, then you can't let people hold you hostage with threats. Cassian studied her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or you have no survival instinct whatsoever. Can it be both? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You realize Octavian will retaliate. Soon. Efficiently. He's probably already planning it. Then we'd better figure out what he's protecting before he has a chance to hide the evidence. How do you propose we do that? Seraphine thought about the pattern she'd noticed during the council session. The glances between Octavian and Vivienne. The way information flowed too smoothly. The defensive reaction to questions about bandit attacks. Someone in this fortress is orchestrating those raids, using them to eliminate political opposition while maintaining plausible deniability. Malric's probably involved, but he's not smart enough to design the whole operation. That takes someone with deep knowledge of trade routes, political vulnerabilities, and court connections. You think Octavian is behind it. I think Octavian benefits from constant low-level conflict that requires your attention on military matters instead of governance reform. I think he's been encouraging your brutality for years because it maintains the power structure he controls. And I think the moment you started questioning that structure, he became your enemy whether or not you realize it yet. Cassian was quiet for a long moment. If you're wrong about this, if we investigate the Chancellor based on speculation and find nothing, I'll have alienated the one person who's kept this court functioning for 3 decades. And if I'm right and you do nothing, he'll destroy any chance of actual change while maintaining his influence through fear and manipulation. Either way, there's risk. You just have to decide which outcome you can live with. The Duke moved back to the windows, staring out at his fortress like he was seeing it for the first time. 8 years. I've ruled these territories for 8 years and never once questioned whether the people closest to me were actually loyal or just exceptionally good at hiding their knives. That's what isolation does. Makes you powerful and blind simultaneously. How do we investigate without tipping him off? We start with the trade reports. Cross-reference attacked caravans with houses that have opposed expansion proposals. Map the patterns. If there's correlation, we dig deeper. Quietly. And if we find proof, then you have to decide whether you're willing to move against the man who taught you how to rule. Because that's what this comes down to. Octavian has been shaping your entire philosophy of governance. If he's corrupt, if he's been manipulating you, then everything you've built is compromised. The weight of that realization settled over the room like snow, accumulating on ancient stone. Cassian turned back to face her. Why are you helping me? Really? Your father's debt gives you reason to hate me. My reputation gives you every justification to fear me. Yet you're risking your life to challenge the most powerful people in this fortress. Why? Seraphine considered lying. Considered giving some noble answer about justice or doing what's right. But they'd agreed on honesty. Because you're the first powerful person I've met who actually seemed to care that he'd become a monster. Most people in your position would rationalize it, call it necessary, blame circumstances. But you looked genuinely horrified when I pointed out what you'd become. That's rare. Maybe worth saving. And if I can't be saved, then at least we tried. That counts for something. Not if we're both dead, true. But I'd rather die trying to fix something broken than live comfortably pretending everything's fine. Cassian crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. You're remarkable. You know that? I'm stubborn and probably suicidal. There's a difference. No. His voice dropped lower. You walked into a fortress ruled by fear and refused to bow. You challenged the most dangerous man in the Northern Territories to his face. You're trying to reform a system designed to crush anyone who questions it. That's not stubbornness. That's courage I've rarely seen in soldiers, much less noble daughters. The compliment caught her completely off guard. Seraphine felt heat rising in her cheeks and forced herself to maintain eye contact. Flattery won't make the next few weeks any less dangerous. Not flattery. Recognition. His hand came up, almost touching her face before he seemed to catch himself and lowered it. We should get started on those trade reports. The longer we wait, the more time Octavian has to cover tracks. Right. Work. Focus on work instead of whatever this tension was building between them. Seraphine stepped back, creating distance that felt both necessary and disappointing. I'll need access to the full archives. Not just recent reports, but historical patterns going back at least 3 years. Done. Cassian moved to his desk and wrote something on parchment, sealing it with his personal sigil. This authorizes you to access any document in Ravenwick's records. The archivists will comply or answer to me directly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If you're right about Octavian, we're about to start a war that makes border bandit raids look like children's games. Then I guess we'd better win. Botch. The archives occupied the fortress's lowest levels. Carved directly into the mountain, Ravenwyck was built on. Stone corridors stretched into darkness, lined with shelves holding centuries of records, trade agreements, military reports, tax ledgers, birth records and death certificates and marriage contracts, the accumulated bureaucracy of generations. Seraphine spent the next 4 days buried in documents that turned her fingers black with ink and made her eyes ache from reading by candlelight. Clara brought meals that went mostly uneaten. Servants whispered about the crazy advisor living in the archives like some kind of obsessed scholar. But patterns emerged. 3 years ago, bandit attacks had been genuinely random, hitting wealthy caravans regardless of political affiliation, the kind of opportunistic theft expected in territories this large. Then something changed. 27 months back, attacks became selective. Houses that opposed Chancellor Octavian's policy recommendations suffered losses. Houses that supported him traveled safely. The correlation was subtle at first, easy to miss in the chaos of incomplete reports and regional variations. But over time, it became undeniable. Political opposition led to economic vulnerability, led to increased willingness to compromise on positions. A perfect system for maintaining control without obvious force. Seraphine found 17 specific instances where houses changed their votes on key issues within 3 months of suffering significant losses to bandit raids. 17 instances where economic pressure accomplished what political debate couldn't. The evidence was circumstantial, no direct proof linking Octavian to the attacks, but the pattern was damning. She was compiling the final report when footsteps echoed through the archives. Not servant footsteps. These moved with military precision. Lord Malric emerged from the shadows like a nightmare taking physical form. He was alone. That was probably intentional. Lady Seraphine, his voice filled the stone corridor. Working late? She forced herself to remain seated at the research table, documents spread before her, gathering information, trying to understand Ravenwick's complexities. Admirable dedication. Malric moved closer, his bulk blocking the narrow exit. Though I wonder if perhaps you're looking for things that would be better left unfound. I'm looking for truth. Whether that's better left unfound depends entirely on what that truth reveals. He laughed. No warmth in it. You really are as naive as the Chancellor said. Walking into situations you don't understand, asking questions that get people killed. If asking questions gets people killed, maybe the problem isn't the questions. Maybe the problem is advisors who don't know when to stop asking. Malric stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be threatening without being overtly aggressive. You've made powerful enemies in less than 2 weeks, girl. That's impressive in its own terrible way. I've asked legitimate questions that exposed uncomfortable truths. If that creates enemies, they were already opposed to anything resembling honest governance. You think you're fighting for justice, noble cause, pure intentions. But you're really just disrupting systems that have maintained stability for decades. Do you know what happens when stability collapses? People die. Lots of them. Is your pride worth that? This isn't about pride. Seraphine met his gaze directly. It's about whether Ravenwyck functions through legitimate authority or organized corruption disguised as governance. And you think the Duke cares about that distinction? Malric leaned forward, voice dropping. Cassian Dravenmore killed his own father and brother to seize power. He's executed hundreds of people for crimes ranging from treason to simple inconvenience. You believe that man suddenly developed a conscience because you challenged him at dinner? I believe that man is tired of being alone in a fortress full of people who fear him. I believe he's capable of more than the monster everyone expects him to be. And I believe he's willing to try. Then you're a fool. Malric straightened. The Duke doesn't change. He uses people until they're no longer useful, then discards them. You're a curiosity right now. Interesting. Different. But the moment you become inconvenient or demanding or actually threaten the power structure that keeps him on top, you'll disappear like everyone else who's challenged the natural order. Maybe, Seraphine kept her voice level despite her racing heart, or maybe you're terrified that he actually might change, because that would expose every corrupt system you've spent years building and benefiting from. Which is it, Lord Malric? Are you warning me out of concern? Or threatening me because I'm getting too close to truths you'd prefer stayed hidden? His expression hardened into something ugly. You should be very careful walking these corridors alone at night. The fortress has so many dangers, loose stones, unstable stairs. Accidents happen to careless people. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. From someone who survived Ravenwyck's politics far longer than some naive girl playing at being important. He turned and walked back into the shadows, footsteps echoing until they faded completely. Seraphine waited until she was absolutely certain he was gone before letting herself shake. That had been a direct threat delivered with plausible deniability. Malric wanted her scared, wanted her to understand that continuing this investigation would result in accidents that couldn't be traced back to anyone specific, which meant she was right. The corruption ran deeper than just suspicious patterns. It was organized, protected, and willing to kill to maintain itself. She gathered her documents and headed back towards safer areas of the fortress, acutely aware of every shadow, every echo, every potential ambush point in the winding corridors. Halfway to the main levels, she encountered Cassian coming down the stairs with 2 guards. The relief that flooded through her was almost embarrassing. I was coming to find you. His eyes scanned her face, reading tension immediately. What happened? Lord Malric paid me a visit. Friendly advice about the dangers of working alone at night in unstable areas. Cassian's expression went completely cold. Did he touch you? No, just verbal threats disguised as concern. But the message was clear. Stop investigating or accidents happen. The Duke turned to his guards. Find Lord Malric. Bring him to my study, now. The guards departed at a run. Cassian gestured for Seraphine to follow him upstairs, his movements controlled but radiating barely contained fury. They reached his study and he closed the door with more force than necessary. Then he turned to face her, and the expression on his face was the Iron Duke everyone feared. No one threatens you. His voice was absolutely flat. No one. I don't care about their rank or resources or political connections. You're under my direct protection, and anyone who forgets that learns exactly why people call me the Iron Duke. Cassian? No. He moved closer, and Seraphine realized she'd never actually seen him truly angry before. Controlled, yes. Cold, yes. But this was rage held in check by sheer force of will. You're trying to help me become something better. You're risking everything to challenge corruption I was too blind or too comfortable to see. And Malric thinks he can intimidate you with veiled threats in dark corridors? That ends tonight. Don't execute him. The words came out fast. Please, that proves his point, that you solve problems through violence instead of actual justice. I'm not going to execute him. Cassian's smile was terrifying. I'm going to make him wish I had. What does that mean? It means Lord Malric is about to learn that protecting you is more important to me than maintaining comfortable political alliances. It means everyone in this fortress is about to understand that threats against my advisor result in consequences that execution would be merciful compared to. You're scaring me. Good. His expression softened slightly. You should be scared. Not of me. Of what happens when powerful men realize you're worth protecting. Because that changes every calculation they've made about how to maintain control. A knock interrupted. The guards returned with Lord Malric between them, looking significantly less confident than he had in the archives. Cassian gestured to a chair. Sit. Malric sat. The guards positioned themselves blocking the door. Your Grace, if this is about my conversation with Lady Seraphine, you threatened her, Cassian's voice was conversational, warned her about accidents in dark corridors, suggested that continuing her work might result in unfortunate incidents. Did I miss anything? I was expressing legitimate concern about... You threatened the woman I've placed under my direct protection and given authority equal to the Chancellor himself. That's not concern. That's stupidity so profound I'm genuinely questioning whether you possess basic survival instincts. Lord Malric's face flushed. With respect, Your Grace, Lady Seraphine has been making accusations without proof, disrupting council proceedings, insulting advisors who've served loyally for decades. Someone needed to explain the potential consequences of her recklessness. So you took it upon yourself to threaten her with death disguised as accident. Cassian circled behind Malric's chair like a predator selecting the best angle of attack. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think she wouldn't tell me? Or did you assume I'd ignore it because maintaining your military support is more important than protecting one advisor? The military commander shifted uncomfortably. I assumed Your Grace would understand the need for discretion when dealing with disruptive elements. Disruptive elements. Cassian's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, infinitely more dangerous than shouting. You mean someone who asks questions that expose corruption you benefit from? Someone who threatens the comfortable systems you and the Chancellor have built while pretending to serve my interests? That's not... Strip him. The command came without warning, without emotion, like ordering furniture moved. The guards hesitated for exactly 1 second before obeying. They grabbed Malric, who struggled and protested and systematically removed his expensive coat, his silk shirt, his boots, left him sitting in the Duke's study in nothing but undergarments, all dignity stripped away. Seraphine watched, horrified and fascinated. Cassian circled to stand directly in front of the humiliated lord. Here's what happens next. You return to your estate in the Eastern Territories. Tonight. You remain there until I summon you back. Every trade agreement you control, every military command you hold, every political alliance you've built, all of it frozen until I personally review whether your service to Ravenwyke has been legitimate or just elaborate theft disguised as governance. Your Grace, please. Your lands remain yours. Your title remains yours. But your influence ends the moment you leave this room. And if I discover that you've been orchestrating bandit attacks to eliminate political opposition, If I find proof that you've been working with the Chancellor to manipulate me into maintaining systems that serve your interests instead of the territories, then what I do to you will make every brutal execution I've ordered look merciful. Malric's face had gone from red to pale white. This is because of her, because she... No. Cassian leaned down until they were eye to eye. This is because you forgot that every ounce of power you wield comes from me. You forgot that threatening someone under my protection is threatening me. You forgot that the Iron Duke doesn't tolerate disloyalty, and threatening my advisor is the ultimate expression of disloyalty. He straightened and gestured to the guards. Escort Lord Malric to the gates. Make sure he understands that returning without explicit summons results in immediate execution. The guards hauled Malric to his feet and dragged him from the study, still protesting, still trying to salvage some scrap of dignity. The door closed. Silence fell like snow. Seraphine found her voice. That was brutal. Yes. Cassian moved to pour wine with hands that were completely steady. It was also necessary. Malric needed to understand that the old rules no longer apply, that protecting you takes precedence over maintaining comfortable alliances. Everyone else who witnessed what just happened needs to understand the same thing. You humiliated one of the most powerful military commanders in the Northern Territories. He'll never forgive that. I know. He handed her a glass. But he'll also never forget it. Fear and humiliation are more effective than execution for sending messages. Dead men can't spread warnings. Broken, prideful men tell everyone what happens when they cross the Duke. This is still ruling through fear. Yes. But now the fear serves a different purpose. Before, people feared questioning me. Now they fear threatening what I've chosen to protect. That's progress. Imperfect, brutal progress, but progress. Seraphine sipped wine that tasted like smoke and regret. What happens when Octavian hears about this? He'll escalate. Faster than I expected. We've just declared war on the entire system he's spent decades building. He can't let that stand. So what do? We finish your investigation, find the proof, present it to the full council, and force every noble in Ravenwick to choose sides publicly. Because that's the only way this ends. Not with subtle political maneuvering, but with open confrontation where everyone's loyalties become clear. And if we lose, then we both die, and Ravenwick continues exactly as it has for generations. Corrupt, brutal, slowly rotting from within while pretending everything's fine. Seraphine met his eyes. That's not going to happen. No, Cassian smiled. Genuinely this time. It's not. Because you're too stubborn to fail and I'm too tired of being a monster to go back. They stood in silence, drinking wine and contemplating the war they'd just started. Somewhere in Ravenwick's depths, Chancellor Octavian was receiving news of Lord Malric's public humiliation. Somewhere in the noble quarters, families were recalculating alliances based on the Duke's sudden willingness to destroy powerful supporters for one advisor's protection. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fortress walls, forces that had been content to wait and watch were starting to move. Because nothing destabilizes power faster than the perception that the person wielding it has developed a weakness. And Duke Cassian Dravenmore had just announced to the entire court that Seraphine Vale was exactly that. The next 72 hours moved like a blade sliding between ribs, slow enough to feel every inch of penetration, fast enough that stopping it became impossible. Seraphine worked through the archives with methodical precision, cross-referencing bandit attacks against political votes, trade disruptions against policy changes, casualties against opposition to Chancellor Octavian's recommendations. The pattern wasn't just visible anymore. It was undeniable, mathematical, a perfect system of control disguised as random chaos. She compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Dates, locations, names. The correlation was so precise that claiming coincidence would insult basic intelligence. 23 specific instances over 27 months, where houses opposing the Chancellor's policies suffered devastating losses within weeks of voting against him. 23 instances where economic ruin convinced previously stubborn nobles to reconsider their positions. And in every case, the attacks stopped the moment political cooperation resumed. But correlation still wasn't proof, not the kind that would convince a council full of people who benefited from maintaining the current system. What she needed was direct evidence, documents, correspondence, something linking Octavian to the coordination of these attacks. That's what brought her to Cassian's study at midnight on the third day, exhausted and covered in archive dust, carrying a leather folder that felt heavier than it should. He was still awake, reviewing military reports by candlelight. The man apparently never slept. Or maybe ruling through fear and isolation didn't allow for rest. I found it. Her voice came out rougher than intended. 3 years of patterns. Every attack mapped against every political decision. The correlation is perfect. Too perfect to be anything except intentional. Cassian looked up, and the exhaustion on his face matched hers. Show me. She spread the documents across his desk. Charts showing attack frequency. Lists of affected houses. Timelines demonstrating how economic pressure preceded political cooperation. It was damning, comprehensive, irrefutable as pattern evidence. But his expression didn't show triumph, just grim acceptance of something he'd probably suspected but hoped wasn't true. This proves coordination. It doesn't prove who's coordinating. No. But there's only 3 people in Ravenwyck with access to enough information to orchestrate this level of precision. You, me, and Chancellor Octavian. Since we know it's not us, that leaves the man who's been my closest advisor for 8 years. The man who taught me how to rule. The man I've trusted more than anyone else in this entire fortress. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. This wasn't just political betrayal. This was personal destruction of the one relationship Cassian had believed was genuine. Understanding that difference is what separates powerful men from broken ones. Most rulers surround themselves with advisors and convince themselves those relationships are real. They're not. They're transactions dressed in loyalty's clothing. The advisor provides value. The ruler provides power. Both parties benefit. Both parties lie about calling it friendship. But occasionally, rarely, a ruler finds someone they actually trust. Someone who seems to understand them. Someone whose advice feels like genuine concern rather than manipulation toward predetermined outcomes. That person becomes more than an advisor. They become the anchor point, the one relationship that makes the isolation bearable. And when that person betrays you, when you discover they've been using your trust to maintain their own power while pretending to serve yours, it doesn't just hurt. It fundamentally rewrites your understanding of reality. Cassian was experiencing that rewrite in real time. We need direct proof. His voice was completely flat. Testimony. Documents. Something that links Octavian to specific attacks. Without that, this is just correlation that he'll explain away as coincidence or incompetence in border security. I know. Seraphine had been thinking about this problem for days, which means we need someone on the inside, someone who's been working with him who's willing to testify in exchange for leniency. You're suggesting we offer deals to traitors. I'm suggesting we prioritize destroying the system over punishing every individual participant. Some of the people involved probably thought they were just following orders, doing what was necessary. If we offer immunity to lower-level conspirators in exchange for evidence against the architects, that's not how I've ruled. Cassian stood, moving to the windows that overlooked his kingdom of fear. Traitors get executed, always. No exceptions. It's one of the foundational principles Octavian taught me. Show mercy to betrayal, and you invite more of it. And that philosophy is exactly what he used to isolate you. Made you believe that any forgiveness was weakness, any trust was vulnerability, any human connection was a liability. He built your entire worldview around principles that served his purposes perfectly. The Duke's reflection in the window glass looked like a man watching his entire foundation crack. So what do you suggest? We identify someone involved who isn't fully committed, someone who participated out of fear or pressure rather than genuine loyalty to Octavian. We offer them a choice: testify truthfully and face exile instead of execution, refuse and suffer the full consequences of treason. And you think anyone will take that deal? I think people do terrible things when they believe they have no options. Give them an option, and some of them will surprise you. Cassian turned back to face her. His expression was the Iron Duke everyone feared, but his eyes carried something different. Uncertainty. The first crack in 8 years of absolute conviction. You're asking me to become someone I've spent years destroying, someone who shows mercy, who offers deals, who trusts that people might choose honesty over self-preservation. I'm asking you to become someone who rules through more than terror. Yes. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her face like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then he moved across the room with that predatory grace and stopped close enough that she could count his heartbeats if she wanted. You're changing me. His voice dropped low. Quiet. Almost wondering. I've executed men for suggesting half of what you've convinced me to consider. I've built an empire on being harder than everyone else, more ruthless, more willing to do what others won't. And you walk in here with your idealism and your stubborn refusal to be afraid, and somehow I'm standing here contemplating mercy for traitors. Is that bad? I don't know. His hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw with unexpected gentleness. But it terrifies me more than any army I've ever faced. Why? Because if this works, if your way actually succeeds, then I've wasted 8 years becoming a monster for no reason. And if it fails, if showing mercy and offering trust gets us both killed, then I've destroyed everything I built for nothing. Either outcome means confronting that maybe the man who taught me to rule was lying the entire time. That maybe I've been a puppet thinking I was a king. The vulnerability in those words could have shattered stone. Seraphine understood something critical in that moment. This wasn't just about reforming Ravenwyke's corruption. This was about Cassian confronting the fundamental question of whether he'd ever actually been in control of his own reign, or if Octavian had been pulling strings from the beginning. That kind of existential crisis could break even the strongest ruler. We'll find proof. She kept her voice steady. We'll expose him, and you'll prove that you're more than what he tried to make you. And if we can't, then we improvise. Adapt. Fight with whatever weapons we have. But we don't give up, and we don't go back to how things were. His thumb traced along her cheekbone. When did you become so important to me? Probably around the same time you became more than a monster I was supposed to fear. They stood in silence, the candlelight throwing shadows across ancient stone, two people who'd accidentally found something neither had been looking for in the worst possible circumstances. Then footsteps in the corridor shattered the moment. Clara burst through the door without knocking, face pale as death, breathing like she'd run the entire length of the fortress. My lady, your grace, you need to come now. Something's happened in the East Wing. Something terrible. The East Wing housed the noble guest quarters, expensive rooms reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking allies. Seraphine hadn't been there since her first night when she'd been installed as collateral. Now it looked like a battlefield. Guards crowded the corridor, servants whispered in clusters, and through an open doorway, Seraphine could see a room that had been systematically destroyed. Furniture overturned, tapestries slashed, documents scattered across blood-stained floor, and in the center of the chaos, a body. Lady Vivian Ashcroft lay sprawled across expensive carpet, throat cut ear to ear, her emerald dress soaked nearly black with blood. Her eyes stared at the ceiling with the fixed emptiness of someone who'd died surprised. Cassian moved into the room with professional detachment, examining the scene like he'd seen 1,000 murders, and this was just another Tuesday. How long? One of the guards answered. Servants found her perhaps 20 minutes ago. Heard sounds of struggle, but by the time they gathered courage to investigate, she was already dead. Witnesses? None who'll admit to it, Your Grace. The Duke crouched beside the body, studying wounds with the practiced eye of someone who understood violence intimately. Single slash. Deep. Precise. Whoever killed her knew exactly what they were doing. Professional work. Seraphine forced herself to look at the corpse despite every instinct screaming to look away. Lady Vivian had been many things. Ambitious, manipulative, probably involved in half the corruption poisoning Ravenwyke's court. But she hadn't deserved this. Nobody deserved this. Cassian stood and his expression was carved from ice. Find out who was in this wing tonight. Guards, servants, anyone who might have seen something. And seal the fortress. Nobody leaves until I have answers. The guards scattered to obey. Cassian turned to Seraphine, and the concern in his eyes was almost worse than the murder. You should return to your chambers. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. Why would I be in danger? Because Lady Vivian controlled significant economic resources and had powerful family connections. Her murder isn't random violence. It's political. And political murders in Ravenwyke rarely stop at one victim. You think this is connected to our investigation? I think someone just escalated dramatically. Whether they're trying to silence potential witnesses or create chaos to distract from other crimes, I don't know. But until I do, you're vulnerable. Seraphina wanted to argue, wanted to insist on helping investigate. But the cold calculation in Cassian's expression told her this wasn't negotiable. She nodded and let Clara escort her back toward her chambers, acutely aware of every shadow, every sound, every potential threat in corridors that suddenly felt far more dangerous than they had hours before. They were halfway there when footsteps approached from behind, fast, deliberate. Seraphine turned to find Chancellor Octavian flanked by two guards she didn't recognize. The smile on his face was the expression of a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. "Lady Seraphine, how fortuitous. I was just coming to find you." Something cold slithered down her spine. "Chancellor." Terrible news about Lady Vivian, indeed tragic, inexplicable. His eyes held hers with the flat emptiness of a snake evaluating prey. "Which is why I'm afraid I must ask you to accompany me to the council chamber. Certain evidence has come to light that requires your immediate attention." "What evidence?" "We can discuss that with the full council present. Please, this way." It wasn't a request. The guards moved to flank her, hands resting on sword hilts. Not threatening openly, just making the power dynamic absolutely clear. Clara made a small sound of protest. The Chancellor's gaze shifted to her like a predator noticing movement. "Your maid may return to her quarters. This matter concerns Lady Seraphine alone." "My lady—" Clara's voice shook. "It's fine." Seraphine kept her tone level despite her hammering heart. "Go. I'll be along shortly." Clara retreated reluctantly, looking back every few steps until she disappeared around a corner, leaving Seraphine alone with the Chancellor and his guards in a corridor far from anyone who might intervene. Octavian's smile widened slightly. "Shall we?" They walked in silence toward the council chamber. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that walking into that room was walking into a trap, but refusing would only confirm suspicion and accelerate whatever was coming. The council chamber was already occupied when they arrived. Every major noble who remained in Ravenwyck. The few who weren't present sent representatives. Even at midnight, even with a fresh corpse in the East Wing, the court assembled when summoned. That kind of response didn't happen for routine business. Seraphine was escorted to a chair in the center of the room, positioned like a defendant facing trial. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. Cassian stood near the windows, face unreadable, but his hands were clenched behind his back hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Chancellor Octavian moved to the front of the chamber, playing to the assembled nobles like an actor commanding center stage. "My lords and ladies, thank you for attending on such short notice and under such distressing circumstances. Lady Vivian Ashcroft's murder has shocked us all. A woman of noble birth and impeccable breeding killed in her own chambers. The brutality is unthinkable." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. "However," Octavian's voice hardened, "our grief must not prevent us from pursuing justice. And justice requires examining evidence wherever it leads, even when that evidence points toward uncomfortable conclusions." He pulled a leather folder from his coat and set it on the table with deliberate care. "Earlier this evening, before Lady Vivian's death, she came to me with disturbing information. She had discovered evidence suggesting that someone in our midst has been working to destabilize Ravenwyck's governance. Someone who has been making false accusations against loyal advisors. Someone who has been manipulating the Duke toward decisions that serve personal vendettas rather than the territory's best interests." Seraphine's stomach dropped. Octavian opened the folder and withdrew several documents. Letters, by their appearance, written in handwriting that looked horrifyingly familiar. Lady Vivian provided me with correspondence she had obtained through her trade network contacts. Letters written by Lady Seraphine Vale to associates in the Southern Territories. Letters describing her plans to infiltrate Ravenwyck, gain the Duke's confidence, and systematically destroy the advisory structure that has maintained stability for decades. He began reading aloud. "My father's debts provided the perfect pretext. Once installed as collateral, I will have access to court proceedings and private counsels. The Duke is isolated, paranoid, desperate for connection. That desperation is the vulnerability I will exploit." The words were like daggers, each sentence a perfect perversion of things Seraphine had actually thought or said, twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Another letter. "The Chancellor is the primary obstacle, too experienced to be directly challenged. But if I can convince the Duke that Octavian is corrupt, that his most trusted advisor has been manipulating him, then removing him becomes not just possible, but necessary. Once the Chancellor is eliminated, reshaping Ravenwyck's governance becomes trivial." Seraphine found her voice. "Those are forgeries." "Are they?" Octavian's expression radiated false sympathy. The handwriting has been examined by 3 separate experts. All confirmed it matches samples of your personal correspondence. The paper was purchased from a supplier you patronized in the Southern Territories. The seal is your family's crest. I never wrote those letters. Then how do you explain their existence? How do you explain that Lady Vivian died mere hours after bringing me this evidence? How do you explain that her throat was cut with surgical precision by someone who clearly had training in efficient killing? Training perhaps acquired during your education at institutions known for teaching far more than literature and philosophy? The trap closed around her like iron jaws. Every piece of evidence was perfectly constructed. The letters were sophisticated forgeries good enough to pass expert examination. Lady Vivian's murder provided convenient urgency and eliminated the one person who could testify about where the documents actually came from. The timing created the narrative that Seraphine had killed to prevent exposure. And the assembled nobles were eating it up because it confirmed what they'd wanted to believe from the beginning, that the upstart advisor was exactly the threat they'd feared. Your Grace. Octavian turned to Cassian. I understand this is difficult. You've grown fond of Lady Seraphine. Her intelligence and boldness are appealing, but the evidence is overwhelming. She has admitted to investigating your closest advisors. She has openly challenged council proceedings. She has isolated you from voices of reason and experience. All of it matches the pattern described in her own correspondence. Cassian's face was stone. What do you recommend, Chancellor? Under normal circumstances, treason of this magnitude would demand immediate execution. However, given the complex circumstances and your obvious attachment, I propose alternative justice. Lady Seraphine should be confined until thorough investigation concludes. If additional evidence confirms these accusations, exile rather than execution. If she is somehow proven innocent, full restoration of position. But until then, she must be removed from any position of influence. It was brilliant, offering the appearance of mercy while achieving the actual goal of eliminating Seraphine as a threat to Octavian's power, and doing it in a way that made Cassian appear reasonable for accepting, rather than weak for refusing. The Duke studied the forged documents with expression that revealed nothing. Then he looked directly at Seraphine. Did you write these letters? No. Her voice was steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. I've never written anything close to what was just read. This is a setup designed to eliminate me before our investigation into bandit attack patterns could expose the actual corruption in this court. A convenient accusation without proof. We have proof. The trade reports. The correlation is not evidence of conspiracy, Lady Seraphine. The Chancellor's voice carried poisonous patience. It's exactly the kind of circumstantial reasoning someone desperate to deflect attention from their own crimes would employ. And murder is exactly the kind of escalation someone desperate to protect their position would employ. She turned back to Cassian. You know me. You know I wouldn't write those letters. You know what we discovered in the archives is real. I know you convinced me to trust you. His voice was absolutely flat. I know you challenged the foundations of how I've ruled for 8 years. I know you've been investigating the man who's advised me since my father died. And I know that Lady Vivian is dead hours after supposedly providing evidence of your conspiracy. So you believe them? You actually think I've been manipulating you this entire time? The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds and destroyed whatever fragile hope Seraphine had been clinging to. I think the evidence is compelling enough to warrant investigation. Cassian's tone held zero warmth, zero recognition of everything they'd discussed, zero indication that he saw her as anything except a potential threat. You will be confined to secure quarters until this matter is resolved. Chancellor Octavian will oversee the investigation with full authority to pursue any line of inquiry necessary. Your Grace, please, guards, take her. They moved with professional efficiency. Seraphine didn't resist. What would be the point? Fighting would only confirm the narrative that she was dangerous. Screaming would make her look guilty and desperate. As they escorted her from the council chamber, she caught Cassian's eyes one last time, looking for recognition, for doubt, for any sign that he questioned this obvious setup. His expression was the Iron Duke, cold, absolute, impenetrable. The man who'd admitted to being lonely and miserable had vanished, replaced by the monster everyone expected him to be. And Seraphine understood with devastating clarity that Octavian had won, not through better evidence or superior argument, through understanding Cassian better than Cassian understood himself. The Chancellor knew exactly which levers to pull, knew that despite everything, Despite all the conversations and confessions and moments of vulnerability, Cassian's deepest instinct was still paranoia. Trust was a muscle the Duke had never properly developed. Octavian had made sure of that for 8 years. And the moment that trust was tested with sophisticated forgeries and convenient murder, it collapsed immediately. Because changing fundamental nature doesn't happen in days or weeks. It takes years, decades maybe. And they'd had barely 2 weeks to try undoing patterns Octavian had spent nearly a decade reinforcing. The guards took her to a chamber in the fortress's oldest section. Stone walls 3 feet thick. Single barred window overlooking sheer cliffs. Heavy door that locked from the outside with iron mechanisms that probably predated the current dynasty. A cell. Prettier than the dungeons, but functionally identical. They left her there without explanation or timeline. Just locked the door and departed, footsteps fading until silence pressed down like physical weight. Seraphine sat on the narrow bed and forced herself to think instead of panic. The forgeries were too perfect. That meant Octavian had been planning this for days at minimum. Probably since the moment she'd challenged him at her first council meeting. He'd anticipated her investigation, had counter-evidence prepared, had been waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Lady Vivian's murder was opportunity. Octavian might have even arranged it, sacrificing one political ally to eliminate a greater threat while creating the urgent chaos necessary to push through accusations that would normally require more careful examination. And Cassian had fallen for it completely. Not because he was stupid, because he was exactly what 8 years of Octavian's manipulation had designed him to be. A ruler so conditioned to see threats everywhere that he couldn't distinguish between genuine danger and manufactured evidence. The door opened without warning. Seraphine stood quickly, expecting guards, or perhaps Octavian, coming to gloat. Instead, Cassian entered alone and closed the door behind him. For 10 seconds, neither of them spoke. He studied her face with an expression she couldn't read. Looking for something. Evidence, maybe. Confirmation of guilt or innocence. Did you mean it? His voice was barely above whisper. Everything you said, about helping me change, about seeing something worth saving, was any of it real? Every word. She kept her voice steady. I didn't write those letters. I didn't kill Lady Vivian. And I didn't manipulate you. Everything I've done since arriving in Ravenwick has been exactly what I claimed. Trying to help you become something other than the monster everyone expects. Then why does the evidence say otherwise? Because Octavian is better at this than we are. He's had years to perfect the systems that keep him in power. We've had days. He saw us coming and prepared a trap we walked into without hesitation. Or, you're exactly as clever as the letters suggest, and you're lying right now to maintain my trust. If I was that clever, I wouldn't have let myself get caught. Unless getting caught is part of a larger strategy we haven't seen yet. Seraphine felt something break inside her chest. This is what he's done to you. Made you so paranoid that even when someone tells you the truth, even when every instinct should recognize honesty, you can't believe it. You've been alone so long that trust feels like weakness instead of strength. Cassian moved closer, and the anguish on his face was raw. I want to believe you. Every part of me wants to ignore the evidence and trust what we built together. But I've trusted before. My father trusted advisors who betrayed him. My brother trusted friends who wanted him dead. I survived by learning that trust is the luxury that gets rulers killed. So you're choosing survival over faith. I'm choosing not to be destroyed by someone I let get close. Again. The finality in those words was devastating. Seraphine understood then that this wasn't just about the forged letters or Lady Vivian's murder. This was about every betrayal Cassian had experienced, every lesson Octavian had taught about power requiring isolation, every instinct that had been reinforced for 8 years screaming that trusting her was the path to destruction. And she couldn't fight 8 years of conditioning with 2 weeks of conversations. Then I guess Octavian wins. Her voice came out flat, empty. He keeps his position. You keep your isolation. Ravenwhite keeps its corruption. And I either get exiled or executed for the crime of thinking people could actually change. That's not... It's exactly what's happening. She moved to face him directly. You're terrified that I might be telling the truth because that means you just chose fear over the one genuine connection you've had in years. But you're also terrified I might be lying because that means you were vulnerable enough to be manipulated. Either way, you lose. Either way, you end up exactly where Octavian wants you. Alone. Paranoid. Ruling through terror while slowly dying inside. Stop. Why? Because hearing it hurts? Good. It should hurt. You're about to destroy the only person in this entire fortress who actually saw you as human instead of a title or a threat. You're about to prove that the Iron Duke is exactly the monster everyone believes. And you'll do it because your advisor, who's been manipulating you for 8 years, provided convenient evidence at the perfect moment. The guards examined the letters. Multiple experts confirmed. The guards work for Octavian. The experts owe him favors or fear his influence. Every piece of verification you're relying on comes from systems he controls. She could see him processing that, see doubt creeping in despite his resistance. You want proof I'm innocent? Ask yourself who benefits from my removal. Not me, not you. Only the man who spent decades building power structures that my investigation threatened to expose. Cassian's hands clenched into fists. If you're telling the truth, if this is all fabrication, then I just publicly condemn the woman who... He stopped, couldn't finish the sentence. The woman who what? The woman who made me want to be something better than what I am. Past tense. Already grieving something that hadn't fully died yet. Seraphine felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Then prove it wasn't for nothing. Investigate properly instead of accepting convenient evidence. Question Octavian's proof instead of blindly trusting it. Be the Duke who thinks instead of the monster who reacts. And if I'm wrong, if I investigate and find more evidence confirming the accusations, then I'm either the best manipulator in Valadorn or Octavian is even more thorough than we thought. Either way, you'll have your answer based on actual investigation instead of political theater. He stood there, torn between instincts pulling in opposite directions, trust and paranoia, hope and fear. The man he'd been, and the man he was trying to become. Finally, he moved to the door. I'll review everything personally. No advisors, no experts with questionable loyalties. If there's fabrication, I'll find it. And if you don't, then I'll have to live with destroying the only good thing that's happened in 8 years of ruling. He left without looking back. The door locked behind him with a sound like finality. Seraphine sat on the bed and let herself shake, because this was the point of no return. Either Cassian found proof of Octavian's manipulation, or he didn't. Either he trusted his own judgment over 8 years of conditioning, or he didn't. Either he chose to become someone different, or he retreated into the safety of being exactly what everyone expected. And Seraphine had zero control over which path he'd take. Outside her barred window, snow fell across Ravenwick's ancient towers. The fortress had stood for centuries, had weathered wars and plagues and political upheavals that made this current crisis look trivial. It would survive whatever came next. The question was whether the people inside it would survive with their humanity intact, or whether they'd all just become different versions of the same corruption wearing different faces. Somewhere in the fortress depths, Chancellor Octavian was probably celebrating. He'd neutralized the threat, isolated the Duke again, restored the power structure that served his interests perfectly. But he'd made one mistake. He'd assumed Cassian would simply accept the evidence and move on like he'd accepted everything else for 8 years. He'd forgotten that sometimes, rarely, even the most conditioned predator remembers what it was like before the cage. Remembers that survival and living aren't always the same thing. And desperate men trying not to drown sometimes make choices that terrify everyone, including themselves. The night stretched on. Guards changed shifts outside her door. Somewhere below, servants cleaned Lady Vivian's blood from expensive carpet. The court whispered and schemed and recalculated power dynamics based on the Duke's obvious return to form. And in his private study, Cassian Dravenmore sat alone with forged letters and genuine doubts, forced to decide whether 8 years of brutal certainty was worth sacrificing 2 weeks of fragile hope. The choice he made would determine everything, not just Seraphine's fate, not just Ravenwick's future, but whether the Iron Duke could actually transform into something resembling human, or whether monsters, once created, stayed monsters forever. Dawn came without answers, just cold light exposing a fortress balanced on the edge of transformation or collapse, and one imprisoned woman who'd gambled everything on the possibility that even men made of steel and fear could choose to bend instead of break. 3 days passed in that stone cell. 3 days of silence broken only by guard rotations and meals delivered without conversation. 3 days of Seraphine watching snow accumulate on the window ledge while wondering if Cassian was actually investigating or if he'd already decided her fate and was just prolonging the inevitable. On the 4th morning, the door opened before dawn. Not guards. Cassian himself, looking like he hadn't slept since their last conversation. Shadows carved beneath his eyes, jaw tight with exhaustion or fury or both. He carried a leather folder that looked disturbingly similar to the one Octavian had presented to the council. "We need to talk." His voice was raw. "Come with me." Not a request, not quite a command. Somewhere between the two, like a man who'd forgotten how normal human interaction functioned, Seraphine stood, every muscle stiff from days of minimal movement. "Where?" "Somewhere we won't be interrupted or overheard." He led her through corridors she'd never seen before, down staircases that spiraled into the fortress's deepest levels, past guard posts where soldiers snapped to attention and then deliberately looked away like they'd been ordered to notice nothing. They ended up in a chamber that looked like it had been built for sieges. Circular room carved directly from mountain rock. No windows, single entrance, walls thick enough to muffle explosions. The kind of place where conversations stayed private even if they involved screaming. Cassian closed the door and activated some kind of locking mechanism that engaged with a series of metallic clicks. Then he turned to face her, and the expression on his face was something she'd never seen before. Not anger, not suspicion, something closer to devastation. He threw the folder on the ancient table in the room's center, papers scattered across stone surface. "I spent 3 days investigating, personally examining every piece of evidence Octavian presented, interviewing witnesses, checking handwriting against authentic samples, tracing the paper's origin, verifying the timeline of Lady Vivian's movements before her death. And every single piece of evidence is fabricated. Sophisticated, nearly perfect fabrication, but fabrication nonetheless." Seraphine felt something unclench in her chest, relief mixed with vindication, mixed with anger at being doubted in the first place. Cassian moved to the table, spreading documents with hands that shook slightly. "The letters are excellent forgeries. Whoever created them studied your handwriting extensively. But they made mistakes. Pressure points don't match. Certain letter formations are slightly off. Things an expert glancing quickly wouldn't catch, but detailed examination reveals. The paper, purchased from the same supplier you patronized, yes, but bought 3 months ago by someone using a false name and paying in untraceable coin. The supplier remembers because the order was unusual. High-quality stock purchased in bulk by someone who didn't want records. Lady Vivian's murder? His jaw clenched. She didn't come to Octavian with evidence. She was killed approximately 2 hours before Octavian claimed she approached him. The servant's testimony about timing was coerced. They changed their statements after I made it clear that lying to the Duke resulted in consequences they wouldn't survive. So Octavian killed her himself, or had her killed? The method suggests professional work. Single precise cut, minimal struggle. Either he did it personally or he employed someone with military training. Why? What did she know that was worth murdering? "I don't think she knew anything." Cassian's voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "I think she was convenient, well-connected enough that her death would create chaos, ambitious enough that claiming she'd discovered conspiracy was believable, and expendable enough that sacrificing her to eliminate you was acceptable trade. That's monstrous." Yes, his eyes met hers, but it's also exactly how I would have operated 2 months ago. Sacrificing one piece to protect the king, using whatever tools available to eliminate threats. Octavian taught me that philosophy. He's just better at implementing it than I ever was. The admission hung between them like smoke. This is what rulers become when they prioritize power over everything else. When they convince themselves that any action is justified if it maintains control. When they surround themselves with advisors who reinforce the worst instincts instead of challenging them. Cassian had spent 8 years becoming exactly what Octavian designed. A duke who valued fear over loyalty, survival over connection, power over humanity. The perfect puppet who believed he was pulling strings when really he was just following patterns someone else had established. Understanding that transformation is what separates men who learn from mistakes and men who repeat them until they're destroyed by consequences. "I'm sorry." The words came out quiet, broken. "I should have trusted you immediately. Should have investigated before condemning you. Should have recognized manipulation when it was happening right in front of me. Instead, I did exactly what 8 years of conditioning taught me to do. Assumed betrayal, chose paranoia over faith, became the monster everyone expects. You were scared. That's not an excuse. Fear is what weak rulers hide behind when they make terrible decisions. I spent 3 days convincing myself you'd manipulated me. while the man actually manipulating me stood there offering convenient evidence and reasonable explanations. I'm supposed to be smarter than this. Seraphine moved closer, studying his face. The exhaustion, the self-loathing, the desperate need for absolution mixed with conviction he didn't deserve it. What happens now? Now I confront Octavian. Publicly. In front of the full council. Present the evidence of his fabrication. Charge him with murder and conspiracy. And either he admits to everything or we end up in the kind of political warfare that tears Ravenwick apart. He won't admit. He'll fight. Use every connection and favor and piece of leverage he's accumulated over 3 decades. I know. Which is why I need you with me. Not as collateral. Not as some prisoner I'm graciously pardoning. As my advisor. My equal. Standing beside me when I declare war on the system that's controlled this fortress for longer than I've been alive. The request was more intimate than anything physical could have been. He wasn't asking her to fight. He was asking her to be visible proof that he'd chosen trust over fear, that he meant what he said about becoming something different.
That's dangerous for both of us. Everything worth doing is dangerous.
His hand came up, fingers brushing her jaw. But I'm done ruling through fear alone. Done being the Iron Duke everyone expects. If I'm going to transform this place, if I'm going to become someone worth following instead of just someone people are too terrified to challenge, then I need to stop hiding behind brutality and start demonstrating that another way exists. And if we fail, then we fail together. But at least we tried. That counts for more than another 50 years of successfully being miserable. Seraphine leaned into his touch, and the simple human contact after days of isolation felt like coming back to life. When do we confront him? Today. This morning, before he has time to prepare additional defenses or manufacture new evidence. We strike fast and hard and publicly enough that he can't suppress it. He'll have allies, people who benefit from the current system. Then we'll discover who's actually loyal and who's just been following the strongest-looking current. Some of them might surprise us. Or they might all side with Octavian because he represents stability and we represent dangerous change. Possible. Cassian's smile was sharp enough to cut. But I'm betting that at least some of them are as tired of living in fear as I am. That some of them would rather follow a duke who treats them like humans instead of assets to be used and discarded. That's optimistic, not like you. I've learned from an exceptionally stubborn advisor that optimism isn't weakness, it's choice. And I'm choosing to believe that people are capable of more than their worst instincts. Shuts. The council chamber filled quickly once word spread that the Duke was calling an emergency session. Nobles arrived still adjusting formal clothes, servants rushing to light candles, guards positioning themselves along walls with hands on weapons like they expected violence. The entire court understood something significant was happening. They just didn't know what yet. Seraphine entered beside Cassian, not behind him, not cowering in the back, but walking as his equal in a way that sent immediate ripples through the assembled crowd. Whispers erupted. Eyes widened. Several nobles exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations without words. Chancellor Octavian stood near the head table, and the expression on his face was perfect surprise mixed with concern. "Your Grace, Lady Seraphine. I wasn't aware she'd been released from confinement pending investigation conclusion." "The investigation is concluded," Cassian's voice carried absolute authority, "and its findings require immediate council attention. Everyone sit." It wasn't a suggestion. Nobles scrambled to chairs like children obeying a parent who'd reached the end of patience. Cassian remained standing. Seraphine stood beside him. The visual symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. 3 days ago, Chancellor Octavian presented evidence suggesting Lady Seraphine had been conspiring against Ravenwick's governance. Letters detailing supposed plans to manipulate me and destroy loyal advisors. Testimony that she'd murdered Lady Vivian to prevent exposure. The evidence appeared compelling. I ordered her confined pending investigation. Octavian's expression remained perfectly neutral, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. I have personally examined every piece of that evidence. The letters are sophisticated forgeries. The handwriting analysis was rushed and incomplete. The paper trail leads to false identities and untraceable purchases made months before Lady Seraphine arrived in Ravenwick. Murmurs spread through the council. Not quite gasps, more like held breath being slowly released. Furthermore, Cassian's tone hardened. Lady Vivian's murder occurred 2 hours before the Chancellor claimed she approached him with this evidence. The servant testimony regarding timing was coerced through threats and intimidation. The actual killer demonstrated professional techniques suggesting military training rather than desperate improvisation. Your Grace! Octavian's voice carried perfect confusion mixed with hurt. I don't understand what you're suggesting. Are you implying that I somehow... I'm stating that you fabricated evidence to eliminate a threat to your position. That you murdered or arranged the murder of Lady Vivian Ashcroft to create chaos necessary for pushing through accusations that wouldn't survive careful scrutiny. That you've been manipulating me for 8 years while pretending to serve Ravenwyke's interests. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The accusation was so massive, so unprecedented, that processing it required complete stillness. Octavian's face transformed. The mask of loyal advisor cracked, and something colder emerged beneath. Your Grace, this is madness. Lady Seraphine has clearly poisoned your mind against those who actually care about your welfare. I've served your family for 3 decades, guided you through... You've shaped me into a weapon you could control. Cassian moved around the table with predatory precision. You taught me that trust was weakness, that mercy invited rebellion, that ruling through fear was the only sustainable path. Every principle you drilled into me served one purpose, keeping me isolated, paranoid, and dependent on your counsel. Because those principles work. Octavian's voice rose slightly. You've maintained stability for 8 years using the philosophy I taught you. The territories haven't erupted into civil war. The noble houses haven't overthrown you. Ravenwyke stands strong because you followed my advice. Ravenwyke stands on a foundation of terror and corruption, and I've spent 8 years becoming exactly the monster everyone fears because you convinced me that was the only way to survive. It is the only way. The Chancellor's composure was slipping. You think showing mercy makes you strong? You think trusting people who haven't earned it demonstrates wisdom? Your father believed that. He died for it. Your brother believed it. He died for it. I kept you alive by teaching you to be harder than everyone else, more ruthless, more willing to do what others wouldn't, and lonelier than anyone should have to be. Seraphine spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension. You didn't keep him alive. You kept him controlled. There's a difference. Octavian's gaze shifted to her, and the hatred there was pure. This is your doing. You arrive in Ravenwyke, and within weeks you've convinced him to abandon everything that made him successful. You're destroying a system that's maintained order for generations. I'm exposing corruption you've protected for decades. The difference matters. You're a naive child playing at politics you don't understand. The Chancellor turned back to Cassian. Your Grace, please. Think about what you're doing. Turning against me means questioning every decision we've made together, every execution, every policy, every strategic choice. Are you prepared to admit that 8 years of rule were based on manipulation? That everything you've accomplished was really my design? It was a masterful final play, making the cost of rejecting him so high that accepting the lies became easier than confronting the truth. But Cassian had spent 3 days in that exact internal battle, had wrestled with the devastating possibility that his entire reign was puppet show with someone else pulling strings, had confronted the choice between comfortable lies and painful truth, and he'd chosen truth despite the cost. Yes, the word came out steady. Certain. I'm prepared to admit that I've been a fool, that I've let you manipulate me into becoming something I never should have been, that everything I thought was strength was really just different expression of weakness, and I'm prepared to start fixing that. Today, Octavian's expression went completely blank. The mask dropped entirely. What remained was calculation without pretense. You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. Maybe. But it'll be my mistake, my choice, not yours. The Chancellor looked around the council chamber, making eye contact with specific nobles. Silent communication passing between people who'd clearly coordinated before. When he spoke again, his voice carried absolute conviction. Very well. If Duke Cassian Dravenmore is determined to destroy himself through misplaced trust and adolescent romance, I cannot prevent it. But I will not stand by while he destroys Ravenwyke in the process. I call for formal vote of no confidence in the Duke's leadership. Shock rippled through the assembly like physical wave. Calling for no confidence vote was technically legal. Ancient law designed to prevent tyrants from completely destroying territories through insanity or incompetence. But it hadn't been invoked in over a century. Using it now was nuclear option, and from the expressions on several nobles' faces, Octavian had been planning this contingency for days. All in favor of removing Duke Cassian Dravenmore from authority pending mental competency evaluation, signify by standing. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Lord Harrington, an older noble who controlled significant northern estates, stood. Then Lady Blackwood, whose family had military connections. Then 2 younger lords whose names Seraphine didn't know, but whose significance was clear from Cassian's expression. 5 nobles out of 17 present, not majority, but enough to demonstrate that Octavian's influence ran deeper than surface corruption. "This is treason," Cassian's voice was ice. "You're attempting to overthrow legitimate authority based on manufactured crisis. We're attempting to save Ravenwyck from a duke who's been compromised by a woman of questionable loyalty and even more questionable motives." Octavian moved to stand with the nobles who'd supported him. "Your Grace, please understand, we don't want civil war. We want you to receive treatment for whatever influence Lady Seraphine has exerted. Once you've recovered from her manipulation, once you can think clearly again, we'll gladly restore full authority." It was perfectly constructed. Paint Cassian as victim rather than tyrant, blame Seraphine for everything, offer path to reconciliation that required abandoning her and returning to Octavian's guidance. Several nobles who'd remained seated looked conflicted, swaying toward the reasonable-sounding compromise. Seraphine understood that this was the moment, the exact instant where everything would be decided. If Cassian hesitated, if he showed any uncertainty, the remaining nobles would side with Octavian because backing the Chancellor meant stability, and backing the Duke meant unknown chaos. Cassian needed to demonstrate absolute conviction, needed to show that choosing her wasn't weakness but strength that different philosophy could produce. And he needed to do it in a way that the entire court would remember for generations. The Duke moved to the center of the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 8 years ruling through fear, plus something new underneath, something that sounded almost like hope. "Let me be absolutely clear. I am not compromised. I am not manipulated. I am not suffering from diminished capacity that requires intervention. What I am is done. Done pretending that ruling through terror is the same as legitimate governance. Done accepting that isolation is the price of power. Done letting fear of betrayal prevent me from trusting anyone." "Your Grace," Octavian started. "I'm not finished." The command cracked like whip. "You taught me that showing mercy was weakness, that trust invited destruction, that the only way to maintain control was through absolute ruthlessness. And I followed that teaching because I believed you had my best interests at heart. I was wrong. You had your own interests at heart, your own power, your own position. And you shaped me into the kind of ruler who would never question your authority, because questioning meant confronting that I'd spent years being a puppet. That's not... You murdered Lady Vivian Ashcroft. You fabricated evidence to eliminate someone who threatened your control. You've been orchestrating bandit attacks to manipulate political decisions for years, and you did all of it while pretending to serve me. That ends now." Cassian drew his sword. The blade caught candlelight, throwing reflections across stone walls. Several nobles gasped, guards tensed. The entire chamber seemed to hold collective breath. Chancellor Octavian Reeve, "I charge you with treason, murder, conspiracy, and systematic corruption of Ravenwyck's governance. You have 2 choices. Confess fully and accept exile, or refuse and face trial by combat, where I personally ensure you understand exactly what happens when you betray me." It was the old way. The brutal tradition that hadn't been invoked in decades. Trial by combat for accusations too serious for conventional judgment. Winner took truth. Loser took grave. Octavian laughed. Actually laughed. Bitter sound without humor. "You think you can intimidate me with threats of personal combat? Your Grace, I'm 63 years old. I haven't held a sword in anger for 20 years. This is theater designed to avoid actual legal process. Then confess. Admit what you've done. Accept exile, and I'll let you live." "I have nothing to confess." The Chancellor's voice hardened. "I've served Ravenwyck faithfully for 3 decades. I won't be bullied into false admission by a duke who's lost his mind over a woman." "Then you refuse trial by combat?" "I refuse to legitimize this farce with participation." Cassian's smile was terrifying. "That's unfortunate. Because refusal to defend yourself when formally accused of treason is legally identical to confession. Which means I don't need trial. I have admission. That's not... Octavian's expression shifted to something approaching panic. You can't execute me based on legal technicality. The council would never. The council follows the law, and the law is clear. Formal accusation of treason requires defense through combat or testimony. You've refused both. That constitutes legal admission. It was brutal, precise, using the exact kind of legal manipulation Octavian had probably employed dozens of times against others, turning his own tactics back on him with surgical efficiency. The chancellor looked around the chamber, searching for support. The 5 nobles who'd stood for no confidence looked conflicted. This had escalated beyond political maneuvering into something far more dangerous. Your Grace, Lord Harrington's voice was careful. Perhaps we should allow formal investigation before invoking execution based on procedural technicality. Formal investigation would take months, during which the Chancellor would have opportunity to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and manufacture new crises. No. This ends today. Cassian turned to the guards positioned along walls. Take him. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. The guards looked at each other, at Octavian, at the Duke, calculating which order to follow would most likely result in their survival. Then the captain of the guard stepped forward. Yes, Your Grace. It broke the spell. 4 guards moved to flank Octavian, who backed away with expression transforming from confident superiority to genuine fear. You can't do this. His voice rose. I have allies, resources, connections throughout the territories. Executing me creates enemies you can't imagine. Then they'll learn the same lesson you're about to learn. Cassian's voice was absolutely flat. That I'm done being controlled by people who think they're untouchable. Take him to the courtyard. Public execution. Noon today. No! Octavian's composure shattered completely. You need me? You've always needed me. Without my guidance, you'll make mistakes that destroy everything. Please. Your Grace, Cassian, we can negotiate. Find compromise. I'll resign quietly. Leave Ravenwick. You'll never see me again. And spend the rest of my life wondering when you'll return with army or poison or some new scheme to reclaim control? No. You taught me to eliminate threats completely, to show no mercy to betrayal. I'm just applying your own philosophy. The guards grabbed him. Octavian struggled, dignity evaporating into raw survival instinct. His eyes found Seraphine. This is your fault. All of it. You poisoned him against me, destroyed years of careful work. I should have killed you the moment you arrived instead of trying to discredit you. The admission hung in shocked silence. Several nobles who'd supported the no-confidence vote suddenly looked far less certain. Octavian had just confirmed everything Cassian accused him of. Destroyed his own defense through panic. Cassian's expression never changed. Take him. They dragged the Chancellor toward the exit, his protests echoing through stone corridors as they disappeared. The Duke turned to face the assembled council. His sword was still drawn. His expression was the Iron Duke everyone feared, but his eyes carried something different. Determination mixed with exhaustion, mixed with desperate hope that this gamble would actually work. Anyone else want to challenge my authority? Now's your opportunity. Stand, make your case, fight or flee or swear loyalty. But choose now because this is the only chance you get. Silence stretched. Then Lord Harrington stood, slowly, deliberately, and instead of challenging, he bowed. Your Grace, I apologize for my earlier support of the Chancellor's motion. His admissions clarifies matters considerably. You have my loyalty. It was calculated, pragmatic, the kind of survival-based allegiance that characterized court politics. But it was also capitulation. One by one, the other nobles who'd supported no confidence stood and bowed, swearing loyalty with varying degrees of sincerity. The chamber slowly emptied as nobles retreated to their quarters, undoubtedly to recalculate alliances and determine how to position themselves in whatever new order was emerging. Eventually only Cassian and Seraphine remained in the massive circular room. The Duke finally sheathed his sword. His hands were shaking. Seraphine moved to stand beside him. That was terrifying. Yes. His voice was barely above whisper. I just executed my closest advisor based on procedural technicality and forced confession. Demonstrated exactly the kind of ruthless brutality everyone expects from the Iron Duke. Everything you wanted me to move away from. You also exposed decades of corruption and eliminated someone who was actively destroying any chance of actual reform. Sometimes ruthlessness serves necessary purposes. Does it? Or am I just rationalizing violence by calling it justice? Maybe both. She took his hand. The important part is you're questioning it instead of just assuming brutality is always correct. That's progress. Progress that terrifies the entire court and probably created a dozen new enemies who'll spend years plotting revenge. Probably. But you're still alive. I'm still alive. And Octavian won't manipulate anyone ever again. That counts for something. Cassian looked down at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe she was actually there. I was willing to execute you based on his fabricated evidence. I doubted you. Chose fear over trust. Almost destroyed the one genuine connection I've had in years. How do you forgive that? I don't know if I do yet. Honest answer. Painful, but true. You hurt me. Badly. Made me feel like everything we'd built meant nothing the moment it was tested. That's not something that disappears just because you figured out the truth eventually. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough. But it's a start. And right now we have bigger problems than our personal damage. You just purged your most influential advisor and demonstrated that challenging you results in execution. Half the court is terrified. The other half is plotting. And we have maybe hours before someone tries to capitalize on the chaos. So what do? We survive. We adapt. We prove that your decision to trust me instead of Octavian wasn't a fatal mistake. And we start building something better than fear and manipulation. How? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Outside, bells began tolling, the signal for public execution. Noon approaching fast. Cassian closed his eyes. I have to be there, have to watch. Can't order execution and then hide from consequences. I know. I'll come with you. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Because you're choosing to confront the brutal reality of what ruling sometimes requires instead of hiding behind delegated authority. That deserves witness. They walked toward the courtyard together, and the weight of what was about to happen pressed down like physical force. Executing Octavian would send unmistakable message. The Duke was done tolerating manipulation. Done accepting that advisors could operate without accountability. Done being controlled by people who claimed to serve his interests. But it would also demonstrate that despite everything, despite conversations about reform and becoming something better, Cassian was still capable of the same brutal decisiveness that had defined his reign. The question was whether that brutality served justice, or just different expression of the same violence Octavian had encouraged for 8 years. And neither of them knew the answer. The courtyard was already filled when they arrived. Servants, guards, nobles who'd decided witnessing was politically safer than absence. All of them gathered around platform where Ravenwick's executions had occurred for centuries. Octavian stood in the center, hands bound, face pale, but defiant. When he saw Cassian, something like disappointment crossed his expression. You're really doing this. Not a question. Statement of disbelief. Yes, Cassian's voice carried across the courtyard. You taught me to eliminate threats completely, to show no mercy to betrayal, to rule through fear and decisive action. I'm just being the student you shaped me into. I shaped you into a ruler who could survive. You're choosing to be a fool who won't. Maybe. But I'll be a fool who's actually free instead of a puppet who thought he was pulling strings. Cassian nodded to the executioner. The man raised his blade, and in that final moment before steel met flesh, Octavian's eyes found Seraphine one last time. You won't save him. His voice rang out across shocked silence. You'll just watch him destroy himself differently. That's all naive idealists ever accomplish. Different flavor of disaster. The blade fell. Blood sprayed across ancient stone. And Chancellor Octavian Reeve, who'd shaped Ravenwyke's governance for 3 decades, who'd manipulated a duke into becoming a monster while pretending to serve his interests, who'd murdered and conspired and corrupted everything he touched, died exactly how he'd taught Cassian to eliminate threats. Completely. Publicly. Without mercy. The body was removed. The blood would be cleaned. Life would continue. But something fundamental had shifted in Ravenwyke's foundations. The Duke had proven he could still be ruthless when necessary, had demonstrated that reform didn't mean weakness, had shown the court that challenging him resulted in consequences. But he'd also proven Octavian's final accusation correct, that he was still solving problems through execution, still ruling through fear even if the targets had changed. And as Cassian and Seraphine walked back toward the fortress through shocked silence, Both of them understood that the real test wasn't exposing corruption or eliminating manipulative advisors. It was figuring out how to build something better than violence while surrounded by people who only understood power through brutality. That evening, as winter sun set over Ravenwick's black towers, painting snow red and gold, a messenger arrived at the gates. Rider from the Eastern Territories. Exhausted horse, urgent news that couldn't wait. The Duke received him in the great hall with Seraphine beside him. "Your Grace," the messenger bowed low. "Lord Malric sends word. He's raised army. 3,000 soldiers marching toward Ravenwyck. Claims you've been compromised by foreign influence and he's coming to restore legitimate governance. They'll reach the fortress in 4 days." The words landed like hammer blows. Cassian had humiliated Malric, stripped him of authority, sent him away with explicit warning never to return without summons. And Malric had spent that exile gathering every soldier loyal to him, every noble house that feared change, every person who benefited from the old system. Now he was coming to take Ravenwyck by force. Civil war. The thing Cassian had spent 8 years preventing through brutal control. The nightmare scenario that made all the executions and fear and isolation seem justified. It was happening anyway. Because trying to reform entrenched corruption from inside didn't convince everyone to support change. It convinced threatened powers to fight back with every resource available. Seraphine watched Cassian's face transform as he processed the message. Saw the moment when hope crashed against reality. When idealistic dreams of peaceful transformation shattered against the brutal truth that some people would rather destroy everything than lose power. "Your Grace." Her voice was quiet. "What do you do?" Cassian looked at her with eyes that had gone completely cold. The Iron Duke staring out from behind brief mask of humanity. "I survive. We prepare for siege, we gather every loyal soldier, we fortify defenses. And when Malric arrives, we show him exactly what happens when people mistake reform for weakness." The words should have been reassuring. Declaration of strength. Commitment to fighting. Instead, they sounded like man retreating into familiar patterns, because unknown territory had proven more dangerous than expected. Outside, night fell across territories balanced on edge of civil war. And inside Ravenwyck Fortress, two people who'd gambled everything on possibility of change confronted devastating reality. That sometimes the cost of transformation is higher than anyone can pay. And sometimes the monsters we try to stop becoming are the only weapons strong enough to survive what comes next. 4 days to prepare for war feels like both eternity and eye blink simultaneously. Enough time to fortify defenses and position soldiers and stockpile supplies. Not nearly enough time to undo 8 years of ruling through fear or convince people that dying for reform is worth the sacrifice. Cassian transformed back into the Iron Duke with practiced efficiency. Issued orders in clipped military precision. Reviewed defensive positions. Calculated supply ratios and troop deployments like he was solving mathematical equations instead of preparing for battles that would leave hundreds dead. Seraphine watched the transformation with growing unease. This was the man she'd first met. Cold, calculating, viewing everything through lens of tactical advantage rather than human cost. The vulnerable person who'd admitted to being lonely and desperate for change had disappeared beneath armor of strategic necessity. She found him on the third night in the war room, surrounded by maps showing Ravenwyck's approaches and weak points. Candles burned low, throwing shadows across topographical features marked with enemy positions and defensive fallback points. "You haven't slept." Not accusation, observation. "Sleep is luxury commanders can't afford before battle." His voice was distant, professional, like they were strangers discussing logistics instead of two people who'd shared confessions and desperate hopes. Malric will attack from the eastern approach. Rocky terrain limits cavalry effectiveness, but provides cover for infantry advance. We'll position archers on the high walls, concentrate heavy weapons at choke points, prepare oil for Cassian. He stopped mid-sentence, but didn't look up from the maps. "You're doing it again. Retreating into the monster because it feels safer than being vulnerable. This isn't retreat, it's necessity. War requires focus. Emotional attachment clouds judgment and gets people killed. So you're just going to become exactly what you were before? Erase everything we worked toward because it's easier than maintaining humanity while under pressure? I'm being what I need to be to survive." His hands clenched on the table edge. "What we all need to survive. Malric is bringing 3,000 soldiers. I have maybe 1,500 defenders who are actually loyal versus just too afraid to flee. The mathematics are brutal. Sentiment doesn't change numbers. No. But strategy without humanity is just elaborate death management. You're calculating kill ratios and defensive positions like you're moving pieces on board instead of commanding people with families and futures. That detachment is what keeps commanders functional when soldiers are dying around them. I learned that lesson years ago from Octavian, who taught you that caring was weakness and emotional distance was strength. You just executed him for corrupting your governance, and now you're using his philosophy to fight this war. The words landed like physical blows. Cassian finally looked up, and the expression on his face was raw. What do you want from me? You want me to care deeply about every person who's going to die defending this fortress? Feel their terror and pain and loss while trying to make decisions that maximize our survival chances? That's not leadership. That's paralysis wrapped in empathy. I want you to remember that changing yourself wasn't a mistake just because it made things harder. That becoming someone who values human life over tactical advantage wasn't weakness, even if it complicates warfare. That the entire point of fighting Malric is to prove reform is possible, and if you abandon everything you learned to win the battle, then you've already lost the war. Silence stretched between them like chasm. Outside, guards patrolled walls in preparation for siege that would arrive by morning. Servants stockpiled food and water. Blacksmiths worked through night repairing weapons and armor. The entire fortress moved with grim efficiency of people who understood exactly what was coming. And inside this room, two people confronted the fundamental question of whether humans could actually change their nature or if crisis always forced retreat into familiar patterns. Cassian moved away from the maps, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. I don't know how to be both. The leader who cares and the commander who makes brutal decisions. They feel incompatible. They're not incompatible. They're just difficult. Seraphine approached him carefully. You can value the soldiers defending these walls while still positioning them for maximum strategic advantage. You can mourn the deaths that are coming while still ordering people into danger. The difference is you'll do it with full awareness of the cost instead of pretending people are just resources to be expended. That awareness will destroy me. His voice dropped to whisper, knowing their names, their families, what they're sacrificing. How do I live with ordering good people to die even if it's necessary? The same way anyone lives with impossible choices. You acknowledge the weight. You carry it. And you use it to make sure their deaths accomplish something meaningful instead of just feeding cycle of violence. And if we lose? If Malric breaks through and executes everyone who supported reform? If your idealism gets us all killed? Then at least we fought for something worth dying for instead of just perpetuating system we knew was broken. Cassian studied her face like he was trying to memorize every detail. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or you genuinely don't understand how bad this could get. I understand perfectly. I'm just choosing to believe that some things matter more than survival. Like dignity. Like trying to be better than our worst instincts. Like proving that powerful people can actually change, even when it's terrifying. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her against him with desperate intensity. Hold that belief, please. Because I'm going to need it when the reality of what's coming makes optimism feel like delusion. She wrapped her arms around him and felt his heart hammering against her chest. For a moment they just stood there, two people stealing comfort before dawn brought consequences neither could fully control. Then bells began ringing across the fortress. The alarm. Earlier than expected, Malric's army had arrived. They reached the battlements as first light broke over the eastern mountains, and the sight that greeted them was nightmare made manifest. 3,000 soldiers spread across the valley below like disease. Infantry formations, cavalry units, siege equipment being assembled with professional efficiency, banners displaying Malric's colors alongside houses that had clearly decided supporting him was safer than backing Cassian. The army wasn't just military force, it was political coalition. Every noble who feared change, every house that benefited from corruption, every person who'd rather destroy Ravenwake than allow reform. Malric himself sat on horseback at the formation's head, armor gleaming in early sunlight. Even from distance, his posture radiated confidence. A rider approached the fortress walls carrying white flag. Traditional parley request. Cassian turned to his captain of the guard. Bring him to the main gate. Under guard. I'll hear what Malric has to say before we start killing each other. The messenger was young, Probably minor noble's son sent because he was expendable. He delivered his message with voice that only shook slightly. Lord Malric offers terms. Duke Cassian surrenders immediately. Submits to mental competency evaluation. If deemed fit to rule after treatment, authority restored within 6 months. If deemed compromised, Regency Council assumes control until heir can be properly educated. And Lady Seraphine? Cassian's voice was flat. Tried for conspiracy and manipulation. Likely exile or execution depending on evidence discovered during investigation. Of course. Tell Lord Malric I have counteroffer. He disbands his army, returns to Eastern territories, accepts permanent exile from Ravenwick, and I'll allow him to leave with his life. The messenger swallowed hard. My lord says you have until noon to accept his terms. After that, he begins siege and offers no quarter to anyone inside the fortress when walls fall. Then you'd better start siege preparations. We'll be waiting. The messenger retreated quickly, clearly relieved to escape intact. Seraphine moved to stand beside Cassian at the battlements. They're not going to negotiate. No, this is about power. Malric either restores the old system or dies trying. There's no middle ground. So what do? We fight. We hold the walls as long as possible. We make every inch of ground cost them more blood than they're willing to pay. And we hope that at some point, enough of Malric's allies decide supporting him isn't worth the casualties. That could take weeks. Months. We don't have supplies for extended siege. I know, which means we need to break their will before our resources run out, or find way to eliminate Malric specifically. Cut the head off and watch the coalition collapse. That's assassination. Seraphine kept her voice low. Everything you claim to be moving away from. It's pragmatic strategy that saves lives by ending conflict quickly. Cassian turned to face her. And it's exactly the kind of brutal calculation that Octavian would have recommended. Which is your point? That I'm still thinking like the monster he created instead of the reformed leader I'm supposed to be. Can you even be reformed leader during war? Or does survival always force retreat into darkest instincts? The question was more philosophical than tactical, but it was also the heart of everything they'd been struggling with. Because this was the ultimate test, not whether Cassian could be thoughtful and merciful during peaceful governance. Whether he could maintain humanity while making life and death decisions under pressure. Whether change was possible when circumstances demanded exactly the brutality he was trying to move away from. And neither of them knew the answer. Noon arrived with this first wave of attacks. Siege engines launching projectiles at the walls, infantry advancing behind mobile shields, cavalry probing for weak points in defensive positions. Ravenwick's defenders responded with arrow volleys and heated oil and concentrated fire at choke points. Bodies fell on both sides. Screams echoed across stone. Blood stained snow red beneath winter sun. Cassian commanded from the walls, directing defenders with the same cold efficiency that had made him legendary. But Seraphine noticed differences. The way he paused when young soldiers fell. The tightness around his eyes when ordering counterattacks he knew would result in casualties. The way his hand clenched every time he heard dying screams. He was carrying the weight, feeling the cost. Remaining functional despite the burden instead of because of emotional distance. It wasn't retreat into monstrosity. It was something harder. Maintaining humanity while doing terrible necessary things. The first day ended with Malric's forces establishing siege positions but failing to breach walls. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Ravenwick lost perhaps 80 defenders. Malric lost closer to 200 attackers. The mathematics favored defenders for now, but attrition would eventually tip scales towards superior numbers. That night, Cassian walked the walls inspecting damage and checking on wounded. Seraphine accompanied him, watching him stop at each injured soldier, learning their names, asking about their families, promising they'd be cared for. It was the opposite of detachment, deliberate engagement with human cost of his decisions. Near midnight, they found Clara in the medical wing, helping treat wounded with same stubborn determination she'd shown staying in Ravenwick despite constant danger. My lady, she looked up from bandaging a guard's shoulder. You should be resting. Tomorrow will be worse. So should you. But neither of us are built for sitting idle while people suffer. Clara smiled sadly. I used to think nobility meant expensive dresses and avoiding work. Then I met you and learned it means being too stubborn to abandon principles even when they make life harder. That's not nobility. That's stupidity wrapped in idealism. Maybe there's no difference. They worked together until dawn, treating injuries and offering comfort to people who'd chosen to fight for something they barely understood. Most of these soldiers probably didn't care about reform or corruption. They fought because Cassian commanded them, because fleeing meant execution for desertion, because they had families inside the fortress who'd die if walls fell. But some fought because they'd seen glimpses of what Ravenwick could become. Had noticed that the Duke who once executed people for minor infractions now showed measured justice. That mercy had entered governance in small ways. That change, however fragile, was actually possible. Those were the soldiers who worried Seraphine most, because they'd invested hope in transformation that might not survive this siege. And if that hope died, cynicism would replace it. The second day brought escalated attacks. Malric's forces had constructed siege towers overnight. Now they pushed them toward walls while archers provided covering fire and infantry prepared to storm battlements. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat on narrow walkways where one misstep meant falling to death. Defenders using every weapon available against attackers who kept coming in waves that seemed endless. Cassian fought alongside his soldiers, not from safe command position but in the actual combat. Sword work that demonstrated why people feared the Iron Duke. Precision that came from years of training and actual battlefield experience. But Seraphine noticed he only killed when absolutely necessary, disarmed when possible, targeted officers over common soldiers, fought with economy that minimized casualties rather than maximized body count. It was subtle difference, probably invisible to most people, but it mattered, because this was a ruler who understood that every death, even enemy deaths, represented failure. That winning battle through massacre was different than winning through minimum necessary force. That violence could be tool rather than default response. Near sunset of the second day, disaster struck. One of the siege towers reached the walls. Attackers poured onto battlements before defenders could respond effectively. The breach threatened to cascade into complete defensive collapse. Cassian rallied nearby soldiers and personally led counterattack that pushed invaders back. But in the chaos, he took a blade across his ribs. Not fatal, deep enough to matter. He kept fighting despite blood soaking through armor, kept commanding despite obvious pain, kept projecting strength even as his movements slowed from injury and exhaustion. They held the wall. Barely. The siege tower was destroyed, the breach sealed. But the cost was devastating. Another 120 defenders dead. Twice that wounded. Seraphine found Cassian after the fighting ended, leaning against battlements while a medic stitched his side. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were still alert. "You should be resting." Her voice came out sharper than intended, fear manifesting as anger. "I'm fine, just superficial. You're bleeding through bandages, and you can barely stand." "That's not fine. I've had worse." He tried to straighten and nearly collapsed. The medic caught him. "Your grace needs proper treatment." The medic's voice was firm. "This wound could fester if not properly cleaned and monitored. After I check defensive positions. Now." Seraphine's tone left no room for argument. "You're no good to anyone dead from infection or collapsed from blood loss. Let them treat you properly." For a moment she thought he'd refuse out of stubborn pride. Then he nodded and allowed the medic to help him toward the medical wing. She stayed with him while they cleaned and restitched the wound. Watched him grip the table edge hard enough to leave finger marks in wood but make no sound of pain. Watched the medic work with practiced efficiency born from treating too many injuries. When they were finally alone, Cassian spoke without opening his eyes. "We can't hold much longer. Another 2 days maybe, 3 if we're lucky. Then the walls fall or we run out of defenders or both. So what do we do? What we should have done from the beginning. I challenge Malric to single combat, personal duel. Winner takes Ravenwyke. Loser accepts defeat. You're injured, exhausted. He has every advantage, which is why it might work. Malric's entire claim is that I'm compromised and unfit to rule. If I challenge him publicly, he either accepts and proves his leadership through combat or refuses and looks cowardly in front of his allies. Either way, we break the Siege Coalition's confidence. And if you lose, if he kills you in single combat, then you flee before the fortress falls. Take Clara and whoever else you can save. Reach the southern territories. Live." The casualness with which he suggested his own death and her survival was almost worse than the wound. "I'm not fleeing." Seraphine moved closer. "If you die, I die defending what we tried to build. That's the deal. That's stupidity. That's loyalty. There's a difference." Cassian opened his eyes and looked at her with expression that held too many emotions to name. You make me want to survive, not just tactically. Actually want to live instead of just continuing to exist while completing objectives. That's terrifying. Good. Terror means you're still human instead of just tactical instrument wearing human shape. He reached for her hand, movements careful around fresh stitches. If I don't survive tomorrow's challenge, you will. If I don't, I need you to know that these past weeks, everything we attempted, the possibility of becoming something better than what I was, it mattered. Even if it all collapses. Even if Malric wins and restores everything. For a brief moment, I was actually alive instead of just functioning. You gave me that. The words carried finality that made her throat tight. Don't talk like you're already dead. Fight. Win. Prove that change is stronger than tradition and brutality. I'll try. That's all I can promise. The next morning, Cassian stood on the battlements and issued formal challenge. His voice carried across the valley to Malric's forces assembled below. Lord Malric, you claim I'm unfit to rule, that I've been compromised by foreign influence and require removal for Ravenwick's safety. I reject those accusations, and I challenge you to prove your claim through single combat. Victory determines authority, no further bloodshed required. Just you and me and our respective convictions about who should govern these territories. The challenge hung in cold air, like blade waiting to fall. For a long moment, nothing happened. Malric's forces stirred uncertainly. Officers exchanged glances. Everyone understood the significance. Then Malric himself rode forward until he was visible from the walls. His voice boomed with confidence. You're wounded, exhausted, desperate. This challenge is a transparent attempt to salvage unwinnable position through personal combat where injury gives me advantage. But I accept, because removing compromised ruler through traditional trial is more legitimate than simply executing him after siege. Terms were established. Neutral ground between armies, swords only, fight to death or surrender. Both sides would honor result. An hour later, Cassian descended from the fortress wearing light armor that wouldn't restrict movement. The wound in his side was freshly bandaged, but still seeped blood through the dressing. His face was pale but determined. Seraphine walked with him to the gates. You don't have to do this. We can continue the siege. Hold out longer. No. This ends today one way or another. Either I prove that changing governance through thoughtful reform is possible by defending it personally, or Malric proves that tradition and brutality always win because people fear change more than they hate corruption. What if it's not that binary? What if you can win the fight but lose the philosophy? Or lose the fight but still inspire others to continue reform? Then I'll have accomplished something even in defeat. But I'd really prefer to just win and survive, to continue the work we started. Despite everything, she almost smiled. That's reasonable. I'm occasionally capable of reason. It's new development. He kissed her then. Not desperate or fearful, just genuine connection between two people who'd accidentally found something real in worst possible circumstances. When he pulled back, his expression was soft. If I don't return, you will. But if I don't, remember that you were right about almost everything. That isolation kills rulers more effectively than assassins. That trust is strength rather than weakness. That changing ingrained nature is possible even if it's terrifying. Everything Octavian taught me was designed to keep me controllable. Everything you taught me was designed to set me free. Then use that freedom to win this fight. I intend to. He turned and walked through the gates toward the neutral ground where Malric waited. Every step was measured, deliberate. The Iron Duke marching toward trial by combat that would determine Ravenwyke's entire future. Seraphine climbed back to the battlements to watch. Clara joined her, along with hundreds of defenders and thousands of attackers, all gathered to witness their leaders settle this through ancient tradition. The combatants met in cleared space between armies, circled each other like predators evaluating threats. Then steel rang against steel and the duel began. Malric had every advantage. Better health, more rest. Decades of military command that included extensive combat experience. He fought with brutal efficiency designed to exploit Cassian's injury and exhaustion. But Cassian had something Malric didn't. Desperation fused with purpose. He wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to prove that the transformation he'd undergone mattered. That becoming someone who valued human life and thoughtful governance over pure domination was strength rather than weakness. The duel was savage, neither man giving ground, both drawing blood. Malric opened the wound in Cassian's side further. Cassian responded by nearly taking Malric's sword arm off at the elbow. They fought until both were bleeding and gasping, until every movement was agony, until spectators couldn't tell who was winning or if both might just collapse simultaneously. Then Cassian did something unexpected. He disarmed Malric with a move that left the older man defenseless on his knees, sword at his throat, one thrust away from death. And instead of executing him, Cassian stepped back. Yield, his voice carried across the battlefield. Acknowledge defeat. Disband your forces. Accept exile. And I'll let you live. Malric stared up at him with expression mixing disbelief and fury. You're showing mercy? To someone who came to destroy you? I'm showing that rulership through measured justice is possible, that we don't have to kill every enemy to maintain authority. That change isn't weakness even when it makes decisions harder. This is exactly the kind of compromised thinking that proves you're unfit to rule. Malric spit blood. True leaders understand that mercy to enemies invites future rebellion. You should kill me. Your advisor Octavian would have demanded it. Octavian is dead because he confused brutality with strength. I won't make that mistake. Yield or die. Choose. For 10 heartbeats that felt like eternity, Malric seemed to consider forcing Cassian's hand, refusing to yield and accepting death rather than public surrender. Then his shoulders sagged. I yield. The words came out broken, defeated. Cassian kept his sword ready but addressed both armies. Lord Malric has yielded. The challenge is concluded. His forces will disband and return to their territories. Anyone who refuses will be treated as independent criminal rather than soldier under legitimate command. The siege ends now. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Malric's officers began ordering withdrawal, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as soldiers decided that continuing without their commander was suicide. The coalition collapsed exactly as Cassian had predicted. Without central leadership and unified purpose, it dissolved into component parts more interested in survival than continued conflict. By sunset, the valley below Ravenwick was empty except for abandoned siege equipment and too many corpses waiting for burial. Cassian made it back to the fortress before collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion. Medics rushed him to treatment while Seraphine held his hand and tried not to think about how close they'd come to complete disaster. He recovered slowly over the following weeks. The wound infected despite careful treatment, requiring extensive healing. But he survived. And while he healed, Ravenwyck began transforming in ways that Octavian would have considered impossible. The execution stopped almost completely, replaced by exile or imprisonment or restitution depending on crimes committed. Noble houses who'd supported Malric faced economic sanctions rather than wholesale destruction. Reform continued, but with measured deliberation instead of rushed changes that sparked rebellion. It wasn't perfect. Some nobles still grumbled. Some houses still plotted. Some people still feared the Duke more than they respected him. But slowly, gradually, perceptibly, Ravenwyck changed. Changed because its ruler had proven that mercy could coexist with strength, that showing humanity wasn't weakness, that leaders could evolve beyond their worst instincts without being destroyed by that vulnerability. 3 months after the siege ended, Cassian stood with Seraphine overlooking the restored courtyard. Spring was arriving in the northern territories. Snow melting, green returning to valleys that had been white for months. Did we actually accomplish anything? His voice was contemplative. Or did we just postpone inevitable collapse while creating new problems? Both probably. Seraphine leaned against the stone balustrade. But that's what progress looks like. Not perfect solutions. Incremental improvements that create different challenges. The alternative is stagnation defended by claiming any change is too risky. Some of the houses still oppose reform, still claim the old ways were better. Some people will always prefer familiar brutality to uncertain improvement. That doesn't mean improvement isn't worth pursuing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I killed Octavian. Executed him publicly using the same brutal decisiveness he taught me. Everything I claimed to be moving away from. How is that progress? Because you killed him for actual crimes after actual investigation instead of eliminating him the moment he became inconvenient. Because you offered him chance to defend himself or confess. Because even in execution you were applying justice rather than just removing obstacles. The brutality served purpose beyond maintaining your own power. Does that distinction actually matter? Or is it just rationalization that lets me feel better about becoming exactly what I swore to stop being? It matters. Not because it makes the violence disappear, because it means you're thinking about consequences and costs instead of just acting and justifying later. That awareness is what separates leaders who improve from leaders who just repeat patterns with different targets. Cassian turned to face her fully. I almost executed you based on fabricated evidence. Almost let paranoia destroy the one genuine thing that's happened to me in years. That's not leader who improved. That's someone who briefly pretended to change before reverting to type under pressure. But you didn't execute me. You investigated. You questioned. You chose uncertainty over comfortable assumptions. That wasn't reversion. That was you fighting your instincts and eventually winning, even though it was terrifying. Barely winning. By the smallest possible margin. Winning is winning. Progress doesn't require perfection. Just movement in the right direction despite constant pressure to retreat into familiar patterns. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with natural ease that had developed over months of proximity and shared crisis. What we built here is fragile. One bad succession crisis. One ambitious noble with enough support. One mistake that makes everyone doubt reform viability. Any of it could collapse everything. Then we build foundations strong enough to survive those tests. We establish precedents that outlast individual rulers. We prove that governing through thoughtful justice works better than governing through pure fear, even if it's harder. You make it sound almost possible. That's because it is possible, difficult, uncertain, requiring constant vigilance against sliding back into old patterns. But possible. They stood in silence, watching spring arrive across territories that had almost destroyed themselves. Watching people go about daily lives in Fortress that felt slightly less suffocating than it had months ago. Watching evidence that transformation, however incomplete, was actually occurring. Clara appeared on the balcony carrying correspondence that required attention. My lady, your grace, these need review before tomorrow's council session. Thank you. Seraphine took the documents and smiled at her maid, who'd somehow become advisor in her own right. How's the new governance training program developing? Better than expected. We have 43 people enrolled. Servants, minor nobles, even some merchants, all learning about law and policy and administration, the kind of broad education that creates informed citizens instead of just obedient subjects. Octavian would have hated that. Cassian's tone was approving. Educated population is harder to control through misinformation. That's the point. Clara's smile was fierce. Can't build legitimate governance on foundation of ignorant fear. People need to understand how systems work if they're going to hold leaders accountable. When did you become political philosopher? Around the same time, I realized that serving tea and arranging furniture was waste of life that could be spent improving things. Your influence, my lady. Seraphine laughed. I'll accept responsibility for corrupting you toward civic engagement. Clara departed to continue her work, leaving Cassian and Seraphine alone again. She's remarkable. Cassian watched the young woman disappear into the fortress. Used to be terrified servant who could barely speak in my presence. Now she's running education programs and challenging nobles who oppose reform. That's transformation that matters. People rise to expectations. Set low expectations and they meet them. Set higher standards and at least some of them exceed them. Is that what you did with me? Set higher expectations and waited to see if I'd meet them? I saw someone desperate to stop being monster and offered him path towards something different. What you did with that opportunity was your choice. The best choice I've made in years, possibly ever. Even though it almost got you killed multiple times and definitely made governance significantly more complicated. Especially because of that. Easy choices don't transform people. Only difficult ones that force confronting who we actually are versus who we pretend to be. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence. Not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful stillness of two people who'd earned right to simply exist together without constant performance. That evening, Cassian made an announcement that surprised even Seraphine. He was establishing formal council where governance decisions required majority vote rather than ducal decree, where advisors had actual power instead of just serving at his pleasure, where reform could continue even if future dukes tried to reverse course. It was radical, unprecedented, voluntary reduction of absolute authority in favor of distributed governance. Half the nobles thought he'd lost his mind. The other half cautiously supported the idea while waiting to see how it actually functioned. But it was genuine structural change, the kind that transformed how power operated rather than just who wielded it. That night, lying beside each other in chambers that had witnessed so many conversations and confessions and desperate plans, Seraphine asked the question that had been building for weeks. Do you regret it? Any of it? Cassian was quiet for a long moment. His hand traced patterns on her shoulder while he considered. I regret the people who died, the soldiers who fell defending walls during siege, the casualties from years of brutal governance before you arrived, the way I executed threats without investigating whether they were actually dangerous or just convenient to eliminate. All of that carries weight. I'll never escape. But the transformation itself? No. Despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty and constant pressure to retreat into familiar patterns, despite knowing that what we're building is fragile and could collapse at any moment, I don't regret trying to become someone worth following instead of just someone people are too afraid to challenge. Even though it's harder, even though ruling through pure dominance would be simpler, especially because of that. Simple doesn't mean correct. Efficient doesn't mean just. I spent 8 years taking the easy path of brutality and ended up completely alone in fortress full of people who hated me. This path is harder, but at least I can look in mirror without seeing monster staring back. You were never complete monster, just person who'd been taught that humanity was liability. Distinction without difference for the people I executed without real justification. But yes, Octavian shaped me into weapon he could control by convincing me that any softer approach invited destruction. Breaking that conditioning required someone stubborn enough to keep challenging even when I kept pushing back. So I'm stubborn. That's my defining trait, among others. Brave, idealistic, occasionally infuriating, generally right about things, even when I desperately want you to be wrong. High praise from the Iron Duke. Reformed Iron Duke. There's a difference. Is there? Or are you just slightly more thoughtful version of the same brutal ruler? The question was genuine rather than accusatory. Seraphine actually wanted to know if fundamental change was possible or if people just became more sophisticated versions of their core nature. Cassian considered carefully. I don't know. Maybe I'm still the same person making different choices. Maybe transformation is just sustained effort to act against worst instincts until better patterns become habit. Maybe there's no essential self that changes, just behaviors that gradually shift over time. Does the mechanism matter if the results are measurably better? Yes. Because if you're just performing reform while staying fundamentally unchanged inside, then pressure will eventually force reversion. But if actual transformation occurred, if your core values shifted, then the improvements are more likely to survive stress. Then I hope it's real transformation, because the alternative means I'm one crisis away from becoming exactly what I was before. And that possibility terrifies me. Fear of regression is probably a good sign. Means you're aware of the danger instead of assuming change is permanent once achieved. They lay in darkness, punctuated by firelight dancing across stone walls that had witnessed centuries of rulers and their failures and occasional triumphs. Outside, Ravenwick settled into night, transformed but still recognizable, different but not entirely new. Evidence that change was process rather than event, that becoming better was journey without clear destination. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter again. The Reformed Governance Council functioned better than expected. Nobles who'd initially opposed it gradually recognized benefits of distributed decision-making. The education programs expanded. Minor reforms accumulated into significant shifts. It wasn't perfect transformation. People still died. Injustices still occurred. Power still corrupted in subtle ways that required constant vigilance. But Ravenwick was measurably better than it had been. Measurably more just. Measurably more focused on human welfare than pure domination. And Duke Cassian Dravenmore, who'd once been known only as the Iron Duke, became something more complex. Still formidable. Still capable of brutal decisiveness when required, but also thoughtful. Also capable of mercy. Also willing to admit mistakes and adjust course. The territories flourished in ways that terror-based governance had never achieved. Trade increased because merchants weren't constantly worried about arbitrary confiscation. Families grew because people felt safer raising children. Innovation emerged because creativity requires security that pure fear suppresses. The transformation wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be. But it was real. And on quiet evenings, when Cassian stood at those same windows overlooking his territories, he no longer saw a kingdom maintained through fear. He saw communities of actual humans whose lives improved because their ruler valued their welfare over his own absolute control. Seraphine joined him one such evening, 2 years after she'd first arrived as collateral for her father's debts, thinking about what could have been. Her voice was soft, thinking about what almost wasn't. If you'd been less stubborn, if I'd been more paranoid, if Octavian had won, if Malric had killed me during that duel, any of those outcomes would have prevented everything we built. But they didn't happen. We're here. Ravenwick is better. That's what matters. Is it enough, though? Enough to justify the cost? The people who died during the siege, the casualties from exposing corruption, the instability we created while reforming. Nothing is ever enough to fully justify death and suffering. But that doesn't mean improvement isn't worth pursuing. You're asking if positive outcomes erase negative costs. They don't. They just make those costs serve purpose beyond pure destruction. When did you become so wise? Around the same time you became capable of asking questions instead of just issuing brutal judgments. We've both changed. For the better? Definitely for the better. Even with all the complications and uncertainties and ongoing struggles, better than what we were. Cassian pulled her closer, and they watched winter sunset paint snow-covered valleys in shades of gold and crimson. The fortress cast long shadows, but they were just shadows, not the suffocating darkness of fear-based rule. Below them, the kingdom continued its imperfect transformation. People lived and loved and struggled and occasionally thrived, not because they were forced to survive under brutal governance, because they were actually supported by leadership that valued their humanity. It was messy, complicated, frustratingly difficult to maintain, but it was real. And in the end, that reality mattered more than any fantasy of perfect control or absolute authority or rulers who never made mistakes. Because the true measure of power isn't how completely you can dominate. It's whether you can transform yourself from what you were into something better despite every pressure to remain unchanged. And Duke Cassian Dravenmore, who'd once believed that fear was the only sustainable foundation for governance, had proven that even the most brutal rulers could choose differently, could choose trust over paranoia, connection over isolation, humanity over domination, could choose to become legends not for terror they inspired, but for transformation they achieved. The name Cassian Dravenmore no longer inspired fear alone. It inspired hope. Complicated, uncertain, fragile hope. But hope nonetheless. And throughout the kingdom of Valadorn, that hope became seed from which genuine change could grow. Slowly, imperfectly, but inexorably. Because once people see that transformation is possible, once they witness power choosing mercy over brutality, once they understand that rulers can evolve beyond their worst instincts, the old patterns of pure domination become harder to sustain. Not impossible. Change is never guaranteed or permanent, but possible. And possibility, however fragile, is how all lasting transformation begins.